Somewhere in the depths of the ocean, there exists a creature that has fundamentally broken the rules of biological aging. A small translucent jellyfish no larger than a human fingernail that possesses the extraordinary ability to reverse its own aging process and theoretically achieve biological immortality. The immortal jellyfish, scientifically known as Turritopsis dournea, begins its life cycle like any other jellyfish, floating through the water column as a free-swimming medusa, feeding on plankton and small organisms, growing larger with each passing season until it reaches sexual maturity. But when this jellyfish faces starvation, injury, or the simple passage of time itself, something remarkable occurs within its cellular structure. The creature does not accept the inevitable decline that every other animal on Earth must endure, instead transforming its body into a younger form through a biological process called transdifferentiation, essentially reverting from its adult medusa stage back into a polyp, the juvenile form from which it originally developed. From this rejuvenated polyp state, the jellyfish then grows back into a mature medusa once again, resetting its biological clock entirely, and theoretically it can repeat this cycle indefinitely, over and over again, avoiding death not through invulnerability but through pure cellular regression and renewal. The mechanism behind this impossible feat involves the jellyfish's ability to reprogram its own cells at the genetic level, causing differentiated cells that have specialized into specific tissues to transform into completely different cell types, a process that violates what scientists once believed was an absolute rule of biology, that differentiation was permanent and one-directional. Yet this tiny jellyfish demonstrates that cellular identity is far more fluid than we understood, that the very concept of aging is not inevitable, but rather a process that can be consciously reversed by a sufficiently adapted organism. What makes this phenomenon even more bewildering is how casually nature permits this exception to exist, how for billions of years this creature has silently cheated death in the ocean depths, while every other animal plays by the rules, growing old, weakening, and dying, as though the immortal jellyfish discovered a loophole in the genetic code itself that biology forgot to close, and continues to slip through it unnoticed. Persisting in the waters of our planet as a living contradiction to everything we understand about mortality and the passage of time. Yet despite this seemingly invulnerable existence, the immortal jellyfish remains fragile in ways that matter. Predators, disease, and environmental catastrophe can still end its life instantly, reminding us that immortality without invulnerability is merely the ability to die later, and that even nature's most remarkable escape from aging cannot protect against the countless other ways that life, in all its complexity, can be extinguished. Beneath the surface of moss and lichen on rocks and tree bark across virtually every ecosystem on Earth lives a creature so extraordinarily resilient that it seems to violate nearly every biological rule we thought was absolute. And this creature is the tardigrade, also known colloquially as a water bear or moss piglet, an eight-legged microscopic animal measuring roughly 0.5 millimeter in length that has demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to survive in the vacuum of space itself. In 2007, scientists conducted an experiment that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of life's fragility by launching tardigrades aboard a spacecraft and exposing them directly to the harsh vacuum of the cosmos, to extreme radiation, to temperatures approaching absolute zero, and to the complete absence of atmospheric pressure, conditions that would instantly kill nearly every other organism known to science within seconds of exposure. Yet when these microscopic creatures were returned to Earth and rehydrated, many of them not only survived this horrific ordeal, but actually reproduced and continued their life cycles, as if they had merely taken an extended nap rather than endured one of the most hostile environments imaginable. The mechanism behind this extraordinary survival capability lies in a state called cryptobiosis, a kind of metabolic suspension wherein tardigrades essentially shut down all their biological processes when exposed to lethal conditions, expelling almost all water from their bodies and entering a state of complete dormancy so profound that their metabolism drops to nearly undetectable levels, allowing them to persist in this desiccated state for years or even decades. Their cells produce special proteins and sugars that stabilize their molecular structures and prevent ice crystal formation that would otherwise shatter cellular membranes, and they manufacture antioxidants that protect their DNA from the relentless cosmic radiation that bombards organisms exposed to the vacuum of space without atmospheric shielding. What makes this phenomenon so intellectually unsettling is that tardigrades possess this capacity not because they evolved specifically to survive in the void of space, an environment they would never naturally encounter, but rather because these same mechanisms that allow them to weather the vacuum also enabled them to survive extreme droughts and temperature fluctuations in their terrestrial habitats. Nature, in solving one problem across millions of years of evolution, inadvertently created a solution to a problem that would not exist until human beings built spacecraft. And we have somehow accepted this as a mere curiosity, rather than recognizing it as a profound revelation about the redundancy and overengineering built into biological systems at scales we can barely perceive with conventional microscopes. Deep beneath the surface of our oceans, in the cold and shadowy depths where sunlight struggles to penetrate, there exists a creature whose cardiovascular system operates in a manner so fundamentally different from our own that it challenges our very understanding of what it means to have a functioning heart. The octopus, that remarkably intelligent eight-armed invertebrate, does not possess one heart as we do, nor two as some other creatures might, but rather three distinct and fully functional hearts that work in concert to sustain its extraordinary life. Two of these hearts, known as the branchial hearts, are positioned near the gills and serve the critical function of pumping blood through the respiratory organs where oxygen exchange occurs in the cold seawater environment. The third heart, called the systemic heart, is located in the center of the creature's body and serves the far more demanding role of circulating oxygenated blood throughout the entire organism, supplying every tissue, every muscle fiber, and every neural connection with the precious oxygen necessary for survival and the remarkable cognitive functions that octopuses are known to possess. This unusual arrangement exists because of the specific physiological demands placed upon an animal that lacks a rigid skeleton, that can compress itself through impossibly small spaces, and that must maintain sufficient oxygen delivery to a brain that is proportionally one of the largest and most complex in the invertebrate world. The blood itself in an octopus is fundamentally different from our own, containing copper-based hemocyanin rather than iron-based hemoglobin, which makes it blue in color and allows for superior oxygen binding in the cold, low-oxygen environments where these creatures hunt and survive. What is particularly fascinating is that when an octopus swims, the systemic heart actually stops beating entirely, which is why these creatures prefer to crawl along the ocean floor rather than expend the metabolic energy required for active swimming, and why they appear so reluctant to move through open water despite their obvious capability to do so. This three-heart system has persisted throughout millions of years of evolution because it represents an optimal solution to the unique challenge of oxygenating a boneless body with distributed neural processing and extraordinary muscular complexity. And yet it remains largely unknown to the vast majority of people who walk the earth above these creatures. The very existence of this three-heart system stands as a testament to the diverse solutions evolution has crafted for survival, reminding us that life beneath the waves operates according to principles fundamentally alien to our terrestrial experience, and that the ocean's depths continue to harbor biological marvels that challenge our assumptions about how living systems must be organized to thrive. Imagine two particles that become so deeply connected that they share a single quantum state, and then imagine separating them across vast distances, perhaps on opposite sides of the universe. And yet when you measure a property of one particle, the other instantly responds with a corresponding property, as if they are communicating faster than the speed of light itself, which should be impossible according to everything we understand about physics, and yet this phenomenon, known as quantum entanglement, has been repeatedly verified in laboratories across the world through countless experiments and observations that consistently demonstrate this inexplicable connection between distant particles. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the nature of quantum mechanics itself, where particles do not have definite properties until they are measured or observed, existing instead in a state of superposition where all possible states exist simultaneously. And when two particles become entangled through interaction or creation, they remain correlated in such a way that measuring one instantly determines the state of the other, even across infinite distances. A concept so unsettling that Einstein himself called it spooky action at a distance and refused to fully accept it despite the mounting evidence. What makes this phenomenon truly remarkable is not merely that it occurs in nature, but that we have become so accustomed to its existence that we treat it as an established fact of reality rather than as a fundamental mystery that seems to violate our most basic intuitions about how the universe operates, and yet physicists have integrated quantum entanglement into our theoretical frameworks, developed technologies like quantum computers and quantum cryptography based upon it, and established it as a cornerstone of modern physics, all while the question of how this instantaneous connection is actually possible remains genuinely unanswered and continues to challenge our understanding of space, time, causality, and the very fabric of reality itself, suggesting that our universe operates under principles far stranger and more interconnected than our everyday experience could ever prepare us to comprehend. Perhaps most humbling of all is the possibility that quantum entanglement hints at a deeper layer of reality beneath the surface of what we observe, a hidden architecture where all particles remain fundamentally connected through invisible threads of correlation, suggesting that separation itself might be merely an illusion born from our limited perspective, and that at the deepest level of existence, the universe is not a collection of independent objects, but rather a unified whole expressing itself through the appearance of distinct parts. When we think about the ancient history of life on Earth, we often imagine a progression that feels intuitive and orderly, with simpler organisms emerging first and more complex life forms gradually developing over millions of years. However, there exists a striking anomaly in this narrative that challenges our fundamental understanding of evolutionary timeline, and that anomaly is the simple fact that sharks existed on this planet for an extraordinarily long period before trees ever evolved. To be precise, the first sharks appeared in the oceans approximately 450 million years ago, cruising through the seas and establishing themselves as apex predators in marine ecosystems with remarkable efficiency and biological design. Trees, by contrast, did not emerge onto land and begin their colonization of terrestrial environments until roughly 350 million years ago, meaning that sharks had already been perfecting their predatory strategies for a full 100 million years before the first woody plants thrust their branches skyward. This temporal displacement seems almost impossible when we consider how fundamental trees are to our modern understanding of Earth's biosphere. Yet it is an irrefutable scientific reality that has been confirmed through fossil records, radiometric dating, and our accumulated geological knowledge. The reason this particular fact feels so deeply counterintuitive relates to how we have constructed our mental model of planetary history, a model that tends to emphasize the dominance of land-based life forms because we ourselves are terrestrial creatures who have evolved within a world already thick with forests and vegetation. Our brains have naturally prioritized the environments we inhabit and the organisms we encounter most frequently, leading us to unconsciously assume that Earth has always looked roughly like it does today, with oceans and forests coexisting as parallel features of equal antiquity. Yet the reality is far more alien than this assumption allows, for when sharks were first patrolling the early oceans, Earth's continents were barren, utterly devoid of the green covering we associate with a living planet, existing instead as exposed rock and soil under an atmosphere quite different from our own. This temporal inversion persists in our cultural consciousness despite being documented in every major paleontology textbook and museum exhibit, suggesting that we continue to harbor fundamental misconceptions about the age and development of major biological systems, misconceptions so deeply embedded in our intuitive reasoning that even direct knowledge of the facts fails to fully displace them from our imagination. When archaeologists excavated the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, they discovered clay jars containing honey that had remained perfectly edible for over 3,000 years, sealed away in darkness and cool conditions, yet still possessing the golden clarity and viscous consistency of freshly harvested honey. A discovery that would eventually lead scientists to understand one of nature's most remarkable preservation mechanisms that operates so silently and completely that we scarcely notice it happening at all. The reason honey never spoils, never ferments, never develops mold or bacterial growth despite being an organic substance made primarily of sugars and water, lies in its extraordinary composition and the hostile environment it creates for any potential decomposers or spoilage organisms. Honey is so dense with dissolved sugars, typically containing between 80 and 84% sugar by weight, that water molecules remain bound to these sugar particles rather than existing freely, a condition known as low water activity that makes it essentially impossible for bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms to access the moisture they require to survive and reproduce. As if the honey itself becomes a self-contained world where life is microbes. No, it simply cannot take root or flourish. Additionally, honey naturally contains hydrogen peroxide, produced through the action of glucose oxidase enzymes that bees introduce during the collection and processing of nectar, creating a gentle antimicrobial environment that further discourages any pathogenic growth without requiring any human intervention or chemical additives whatsoever. What makes this phenomenon even more peculiar is how completely normalized we have become to it, how we store honey in our kitchens without refrigeration, sometimes for years, trusting implicitly in its preservation despite never truly contemplating the complex biochemistry that renders it essentially immortal. Treating it with the same casual confidence we might offer any other pantry staple, while remaining largely unaware that we are in possession of a food substance that laughs in the face of entropy and decay, that requires no preservatives or special conditions beyond basic protection from moisture and contamination, and that could theoretically nourish our descendants centuries from now if sealed properly today. A kind of edible time capsule that bridges past and future with nothing but chemistry and the clever architecture of bee labor. Yet perhaps this is precisely why honey has held such cultural and spiritual significance across human civilizations, not merely as sustenance, but as a symbol of permanence itself, a tangible reminder that certain things, when conditions align perfectly, can transcend the ordinary limitations of time and remain unchanged for generations, connecting us to the ancient past while promising continuity into an unknowable future. Every single banana you have ever eaten, every banana sitting in a fruit bowl in millions of kitchens around the world right now, is emitting radiation at this very moment and has been doing so since the moment it grew on the tree. This is not a metaphorical statement or a warning label on a package, but rather a fundamental physical reality that exists independent of our awareness or acceptance of it. Bananas contain potassium, and within that potassium exists a naturally occurring isotope called potassium-40, which is radioactive and unstable by nature, meaning it continuously undergoes radioactive decay as part of its essential atomic structure. This decay process releases energy in the form of beta particles, and this emission has been happening for billions of years, long before humans discovered what radiation even was, and it will continue happening long after we are gone. The radiation emitted by a single banana is so minimal that it poses absolutely no threat to human health whatsoever. Yet the fact remains that you are consuming a radioactive substance every time you peel one and take a bite. Scientists have even created a unit of measurement called the banana equivalent dose, or BED, which is used humorously, but also quite seriously, to help people conceptualize the actual radiation exposure from everyday foods and activities by comparing them to the amount of potassium-40 found in bananas. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how completely normalized and invisible it has become in our collective consciousness, how we have simply accepted this strange reality without questioning it or feeling any genuine concern about it, because our bodies have evolved over millions of years to safely process this naturally occurring radiation without issue. We do not fear the banana because evolution has equipped us with the capacity to handle it, and yet when we hear the word radioactive in any other context, our minds immediately conjure images of danger and contamination, revealing how our fear of radiation is not rooted in the actual danger of the substance itself, but rather in the unfamiliarity and the historical trauma associated with its weaponization and industrial misuse by humans throughout the 20th century and beyond. This cognitive disconnect between our rational understanding of banana radiation and our emotional response to the word itself illustrates how human fear is often shaped not by scientific reality, but by narrative and context, a reminder that the most dangerous thing about any substance is frequently not what it is, but what we have decided to believe about it. Perhaps this is why the banana serves as such a perfect teaching tool in science education. It offers us a safe gateway into understanding radiation not as an abstract threat, but as a constant, invisible presence woven into the fabric of existence itself, a reality that has nourished rather than harmed us since before we learned to walk upright. When we consider the vastness of the universe, our minds typically resort to comparisons drawn from the natural world around us. And perhaps one of the most profound and genuinely humbling comparisons that astronomers and cosmologists have made is the observation that there are more stars in the observable universe than there are grains of sand on every beach and desert on Earth combined. A fact that seems almost too absurd to be true, yet emerges consistently from rigorous mathematical calculation and observational data. To understand this, we must first establish the approximate numbers involved, beginning with the grains of sand, which, despite seeming infinite when we stand before a vast beach or gaze across a desert horizon, actually total somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.5 sextillion grains, a number arrived at through careful estimation of sand volume across all terrestrial environments combined with calculations of average grain size and density. The star count, however, reaches into the septillion range when we account for all the galaxies that can be observed by our most powerful telescopes, with each galaxy containing anywhere from millions to hundreds of billions of stars, and when we multiply these incomprehensible quantities by the equally incomprehensible number of galaxies that populate the observable universe, we arrive at a figure that dwarfs even our estimates of sand particles. The psychological mechanism that makes this comparison so effective lies in our tendency to seek analogies with tangible, familiar objects when confronting abstract enormities. Because we can touch sand, we can feel it slip through our fingers, we understand it viscerally in a way we can never truly understand the cosmos, and yet even this familiar, graspable substance becomes a mere footnote when placed against the stellar population of the universe. What makes this fact persist as genuinely astonishing rather than becoming mundane knowledge is the continuous expansion of our cosmic horizon through advancing telescope technology, which regularly reveals new galaxies and challenges our previous estimates upward, meaning that even as we accept this already staggering number, scientists continue to discover that reality exceeds even our revised expectations. A perpetual revision that prevents us from ever truly acclimating to the scale involved. The fact that something so overwhelming and essentially incomprehensible to the human mind continues to surprise us despite being scientifically established suggests that there exists a fundamental gap between intellectual understanding and genuine comprehension, a distance that no amount of logical processing can fully bridge when confronting the true magnitude of existence itself. Every atom in your body, from the calcium in your bones to the iron in your blood to the oxygen in your lungs, was forged in the heart of a dying star billions of years ago. And when that star exploded in a supernova event of unimaginable violence, it scattered these elements across the cosmos, where they eventually coalesced into the dust and gas that would become our solar system, our planet, and ultimately you. The carbon that forms the backbone of every molecule in your body, the nitrogen that makes up the majority of the atmosphere you breathe, the phosphorus that enables your neurons to fire, the sulfur that links your proteins together, all of these elements were created not on Earth, but in the nuclear furnaces of massive stars that lived and died long before our sun even existed. When you look at your hand, you are not looking at something that originated here on this small blue planet, but rather at a collection of stellar remnants, reassembled into conscious form, capable of contemplating its own cosmic origins. The mechanism behind this reality lies in the fundamental physics of stellar nucleosynthesis, wherein the extreme pressures and temperatures at a star's core force hydrogen and helium to fuse into heavier elements, and only when a star reaches the end of its life, either through a violent explosion or a slow collapse, do these heavier elements disperse throughout space to become available for new planetary systems and new life forms. What makes this concept so profoundly difficult to internalize is that we experience ourselves as entirely terrestrial beings, born from Earth, sustained by Earth, and seemingly of Earth, yet the scientific evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that we are far more connected to the cosmos than our everyday experience suggests. We have normalized our disconnection from this reality, accepting the notion that the atoms comprising us are somehow fundamentally different from other atoms, that they have always belonged to Earth, and that our existence is separate from the greater universe rather than a continuation of it. Yet every piece of evidence from modern astronomy and physics confirms that you are not merely in the universe but fundamentally of it, made from the same material as distant stars, connected through an unbroken chain of stellar creation and destruction spanning billions of years, a fact that should inspire awe and wonder at every moment of your existence. And yet we move through our lives barely contemplating this astonishing truth. When you feel the warmth of sunlight on your skin, you are experiencing the radiant energy produced by the same nuclear fusion process that created the atoms in your body, a direct and tangible connection to the stellar processes that birthed you. In this way, every breath you take, every heartbeat that sustains you, Every thought that passes through your mind is an echo of the cosmos still reverberating through matter that has been recycled and reimagined across the eons. Deep within the atmospheres of Jupiter and Saturn, something genuinely extraordinary occurs that challenges our understanding of planetary weather and chemistry, something that seems to belong more in the realm of fantasy than scientific fact, yet remains thoroughly documented and accepted by the astronomical community. Scientists have determined through decades of observation and theoretical modeling that the intense pressure and temperature conditions in the upper atmospheres of these gas giants create an environment where carbon atoms, which are the fundamental building blocks of diamonds, are compressed and heated in such a way that they crystallize into actual diamond structures, and these diamonds then rain downward through the turbulent cloud layers in a continuous, unimaginable precipitation that has likely been occurring for billions of years since the formation of our solar system itself. The process begins when methane and other carbon-rich compounds in the atmospheres of these planets are subjected to lightning strikes and intense atmospheric friction, which breaks apart the molecular bonds and releases elemental carbon into the environment. And as this carbon sinks deeper into the planet due to gravity, it encounters progressively higher pressures and temperatures, eventually reaching conditions so extreme that the carbon atoms arrange themselves into the crystalline lattice structure that defines a diamond, transforming the most abundant element into the world's hardest natural material in a process that occurs automatically and without intervention. What makes this phenomenon particularly striking is that we have accepted this reality so completely into our scientific understanding that it rarely provokes the sense of wonder it deserves, as if the notion of perpetual diamond rain on distant worlds has become simply another fact to file away rather than a genuinely spectacular occurrence that should inspire awe every time we contemplate it. And perhaps this normalization stems from the very nature of science itself, which takes the extraordinary and renders it ordinary through explanation and categorization, transforming the miraculous into the mundane simply by understanding the mechanisms behind it. Yet perhaps there is wisdom in this tendency, for when we consider that the wealth of diamonds raining down on Jupiter and Saturn, a quantity that would dwarf all the diamonds ever mined on Earth by incomprehensible orders of magnitude, remains utterly inaccessible to us, we are reminded that not all treasures in the universe are meant to be possessed, and some of the cosmos's greatest wonders exist simply to be known, contemplated, and marveled at from the safe distance of our small, blue world. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson that the diamond rain of Jupiter and Saturn teaches us, that the universe's most breathtaking phenomena need not serve any purpose beyond their own existence, and that true wonder lies not in possession, but in the privilege of understanding. Deep in the forests and grasslands of Australia, one of the world's most peculiar animals goes about its daily business in a way that seems to defy every principle of biology and animal behavior we thought we understood, and that animal is the wombat, a stocky, barrel-shaped marsupial that produces feces in the shape of perfect cubes. A phenomenon so unusual that scientists have spent decades trying to understand why a living creature would evolve to manufacture its waste in such a geometrically precise form. The cubes are not accidental or occasional, but rather consistent and deliberate, with each piece of wombat excrement emerging from the animal's body as a six-sided cube that measures roughly 2 centimeters on each side. And these cubic droppings are so distinctive that wombat scat is instantly recognizable to anyone who has encountered it in the wild or studied it in a laboratory setting. The wombat's digestive system is extraordinarily specialized, featuring a lower intestine that is not uniform in width like most mammals, but rather segmented with alternating regions of different diameters and elasticity, and as the fecal matter moves through these varying sections of the intestinal tract, the muscular contractions and the differing pressures squeeze and shape the waste material in such a way that it gradually transitions from the typical tubular form into this remarkable cubic structure before it is finally expelled. Scientists believe that this bizarre adaptation serves a highly practical purpose for the wombat, because the cubic shape prevents the droppings from rolling away, which means that wombats can leave their feces in prominent locations as territorial markers without worrying that wind or uneven terrain will scatter them. And because the flat surfaces of the cubes catch light differently than rounded droppings would, they become more visible to other wombats passing through the same territory, thus serving as an efficient communication system in the Australian wilderness. Yet what is most extraordinary about this entire situation is that wombats are among the only animals on Earth to have developed this adaptation, despite living alongside countless other burrowing and territorial creatures that might benefit equally from such a system. And the fact that this remains a relatively recent scientific discovery, only thoroughly documented and understood within the past few decades, reminds us that nature continues to surprise us with solutions to problems we did not even know animals were solving, and that somewhere in the intricate biological machinery of these gentle, nocturnal creatures lies an engineering marvel that persists in quiet efficiency, completely indifferent to our amazement or our attempts to comprehend it. Indeed, the wombat's cubic feces stand as a testament to the endless creativity of evolution, a reminder that even the most mundane biological processes can harbor extraordinary sophistication. Deep within the waters of Mexico, there exists a creature that possesses one of nature's most extraordinary abilities, one so profound that it seems to violate our understanding of biological permanence and the supposed finality of injury. The axolotl, a fully aquatic salamander that retains its larval characteristics throughout its entire life, can regenerate not merely skin or small tissue, but complete functional limbs, including the bones, muscles, nerves, and blood vessels that comprise them. When an axolotl loses an arm or leg, whether through predation, territorial conflict, or accident, it does not simply heal the wound and move forward with a permanent disability, as most complex animals must do. Instead, over the course of several weeks, a small bud of undifferentiated cells forms at the site of injury, and this bud gradually extends outward, organizing itself into a perfectly functional replacement limb that is virtually indistinguishable from the original. The process extends beyond mere limbs, as axolotls can regenerate their tails, parts of their heart, sections of their spinal cord, and even portions of their brain with remarkable efficiency. Scientists studying this phenomenon have discovered that the axolotl possesses a unique collection of genetic instructions and cellular mechanisms that allow it to maintain a population of undifferentiated stem cells in a state of readiness. Cells that can be rapidly mobilized when injury occurs to rebuild whatever structure has been lost. These cells receive chemical signals from the injury site that instruct them to proliferate and differentiate in precise patterns, following a kind of biological blueprint that the axolotl's body has encoded and perfected over millions of years of evolution. The mechanism appears to involve the suppression of certain genes that would normally cause scarring and the activation of developmental genes that are typically only active during embryonic growth, essentially allowing the adult axolotl to recapitulate the growth processes of its youth whenever damage demands it. What makes this ability even more remarkable is that axolotls can perform this regeneration multiple times throughout their lives, losing and regrowing the same limb repeatedly without any apparent decline in the quality of regeneration or the function of the replacement. Yet despite possessing this seemingly impossible biological power, the axolotl remains relatively unknown to most of the world, confined primarily to laboratory settings and the aquariums of enthusiasts, its extraordinary capabilities having failed to capture the sustained attention of popular culture or widespread scientific funding. In the Karakum Desert of Turkmenistan, there exists a crater so vast and so relentlessly burning that it has earned the name the Door to Hell, and it has been continuously aflame for nearly 50 years without pause or cessation. In 1971, Soviet engineers were conducting geological surveys in search of natural gas deposits when their drilling equipment suddenly collapsed into an enormous sinkhole beneath the desert surface, creating a chasm approximately 70 meters in diameter and 16 meters deep, a wound in the earth that seemed to expose something ancient and alive. When the drilling team discovered that methane gas was escaping from the crater in massive quantities, they made the decision to ignite it, reasoning that the fire would consume the escaping gas and prevent an environmental catastrophe, a solution that seemed logical at the moment but would prove to have consequences far beyond their initial calculations. What nobody anticipated was that the crater would continue to burn indefinitely, fed by seemingly inexhaustible reserves of methane beneath the desert floor. And so the flames persisted month after month, year after year, becoming a permanent fixture on the landscape, a monument to human intervention and geological misfortune that nobody has ever truly solved. The psychological mechanism behind our relationship with the door to hell is rooted in our desire to perceive nature as controllable and manageable, a force that responds to human action in predictable ways. And yet here we have a situation where a simple decision has snowballed into something that has proven far more complex and persistent than anyone could have foreseen. Engineers have studied the crater extensively, understanding that the heat continues to vaporize groundwater and methane deposits, perpetually feeding the flames in a self-sustaining cycle. And yet, despite all this knowledge, despite all our technological advancement and scientific understanding, we have never actually extinguished the fire or solved the problem at its source. Instead, we have simply accepted it, normalized it, incorporated it into the landscape as though it were always meant to burn there. A reminder that some consequences of human action continue long after the original decision makers have passed away, and the flames burn on into an uncertain future. The door to hell has become a pilgrimage site for tourists seeking to witness this spectacle of perpetual combustion, yet their presence there serves as a strange form of collective acknowledgement. We gather to observe the consequences of our choices burning eternally in the desert, as if bearing witness to the flames might somehow absolve us of responsibility for their existence. In this way, the crater has transformed from an engineering failure into a kind of secular shrine, a place where we confront the uncomfortable truth that not all human problems can be solved, only endured and observed. In the remote and frozen landscape of Antarctica, specifically within the Taylor Valley of the McMurdo Dry Valleys, there exists a phenomenon so visually striking and utterly otherworldly that it appears to defy the laws of nature itself. A waterfall of deep crimson red cascades down the face of the Taylor Glacier, staining the pristine white ice and snow with what looks unmistakably like blood pouring from a wound in the earth. The sight is so visceral and so disturbing that when it was first discovered in the early 1900s, scientists and explorers were genuinely baffled, with some initially theorizing that it must be algae or some form of biological material that had been frozen for millennia. However, the reality behind blood falls, while less supernatural than the visual appearance suggests, is no less fascinating from a scientific perspective. The phenomenon is caused by a subglacial brine pool that contains iron oxide and extremely salty water, creating an environment so unique that it has remained isolated from the surface world for millions of years. When this hypersaline liquid with its high concentration of dissolved iron seeps through cracks in the glacier and is exposed to the oxygen in the atmosphere, the iron oxidizes almost immediately, producing that distinctive rust-red coloration that gives the waterfall its haunting appearance. The water itself is far saltier than ocean water, making it so dense that it actually flows separately from freshwater, sinking rather than mixing, which allows it to maintain its crimson hue as it descends. What makes this phenomenon persist despite having no logical reason to continue is the remarkable isolation of these subglacial environments, which have remained sealed off from surface contamination for approximately 2 million years, creating a time capsule of sorts that contains ancient microbial life and chemical compositions we rarely encounter in the modern world. The waterfall continues to flow because the pressure from the glacial ice above continues to force this ancient brine toward the surface, an unstoppable geological process that has nothing to do with seasons or climate patterns in any conventional sense, ensuring that Blood Falls remains one of the most genuinely surreal natural wonders on our planet. The discovery of Blood Falls has fundamentally changed our understanding of extremophile organisms, life forms that thrive in conditions we once thought utterly inhospitable, and has prompted scientists to reconsider where else on Earth, and potentially beyond it on icy moons like Europa, similar isolated microbial ecosystems might exist, hidden away in the deep subsurface where ancient chemistry still unfolds in darkness. Deep in the remote rainforests of Peru, there exists a river that defies the very laws of nature as we understand them, a waterway so hot that the water itself approaches boiling temperatures without any volcanic activity occurring directly beneath it, earning it the name that locals have called it for centuries, Mpemba, or the Boiling River. This extraordinary phenomenon stretches for approximately 6 kilometers through the Amazon basin, and at certain points along its course, the water temperature reaches approximately 86 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cook an animal alive within minutes should it accidentally stumble into the current. The river maintains this extreme temperature year-round, regardless of seasonal changes or weather patterns, creating a surreal landscape where steam rises perpetually from the water's surface, and the surrounding vegetation appears almost alien in its adaptation to such extraordinary heat. Scientists have long puzzled over the mechanism that produces such consistent thermal energy, and the prevailing explanation points to an intricate system of geothermal activity occurring deep beneath the Earth's crust, where superheated water from the planet's interior travels upward through fractured rock and mineral-rich geological formations, eventually emerging into the river itself and raising its overall temperature to these dangerous levels. The heat is distributed along the entire stretch of the river through a combination of natural convection currents and the continuous injection of geothermally heated groundwater, creating a self-perpetuating system that has maintained this exact state for thousands of years, perhaps longer than recorded human history itself. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is how perfectly it demonstrates the raw, indifferent power of geological forces operating beneath our feet. The reminder that beneath the seemingly stable ground we walk upon exists a churning, dynamic system of unimaginable heat and pressure that could, at any moment, reshape the landscape in ways we cannot control or predict. The boiling river persists as a geographical anomaly that challenges our assumptions about what constitutes a natural river. Yet it flows with the same constancy and inevitability as any other waterway on Earth, neither threatening nor receding, simply existing in its extreme state as it has for millennia, a profound and humbling reminder of the planet's capacity to generate phenomena that seem impossible until you stand before them and feel the heat radiating against your skin. Local indigenous communities have long incorporated the boiling river into their spiritual traditions and practical survival strategies, viewing it not as a curse, but as a manifestation of the Earth's living consciousness, a sacred space where the boundary between the physical and metaphysical worlds grows thin and permeable. Beneath the frozen surface of the Antarctic Ocean, where temperatures plunge far below what most life on Earth could possibly endure, there exists a phenomenon so otherworldly and so thoroughly real that it seems almost impossible that it occurs naturally without human intervention or manipulation. These formations are called brinicles, and they are essentially frozen columns of extremely salty water that descend from the sea ice above like icy stalactites reaching downward into the darkness of the ocean below. When seawater begins to freeze at the surface, the salt within that water cannot be incorporated into the crystalline structure of ice in the same way that fresh water freezes, and instead this salt becomes rejected and expelled downward into the liquid ocean beneath, creating what scientists call brine, which is water with an extraordinarily high concentration of salt. This brine is denser than the surrounding seawater, so it sinks, and as it sinks through the much colder water immediately adjacent to the ice shelf above, it causes that seawater to freeze around the descending column of salt water, creating a tube of ice that continues to grow longer and longer as the process perpetuates itself downward into the depths. The brinicle becomes a deadly pathway, a frozen tunnel of such extreme salinity and cold that when it reaches the seafloor, the brine spreads across the bottom and instantly freezes everything it touches, killing starfish and sea urchins and other delicate creatures that have evolved over millions of years to survive in the deep ocean, but cannot withstand the sudden introduction of water so cold and so saturated with salt that it burns their tissue at the cellular level. What makes this phenomenon so remarkable is that it persists in complete silence and absolute darkness, happening constantly in the waters beneath Antarctic ice shelves where no human observer has ever witnessed it directly, and it will continue to happen regardless of whether anyone knows about it or cares about it or even believes it is real. The brinicle represents nature operating at scales and in places so removed from human experience that we only discovered their existence through underwater cameras and research expeditions. Yet they have been forming in the same way for millions of years, sculpting the ocean floor and creating invisible highways of death through the freezing water with perfect consistency and mechanical certainty. The brinicle's lethal efficiency serves as a reminder that some of Earth's most consequential processes operate entirely beyond the reach of human awareness, shaping ecosystems and determining which creatures survive and which perish in environments where the laws of chemistry and physics supersede all other considerations, indifferent to observation or understanding. Deep within the Maracaibo Basin of Venezuela, where the Catatumbo River flows into Lake Maracaibo, there exists one of the most extraordinary and persistent electrical phenomena on Earth, a place where the sky seems to be in a constant state of violent convulsion, where lightning strikes with such frequency and intensity that it defies conventional meteorological understanding. The Catatumbo Lightning, as it has been named, occurs almost every single night throughout most of the year, creating what witnesses and meteorologists have described as a nearly continuous display of electrical discharge that illuminates the night sky with such regularity and power that sailors once used it as a natural navigational beacon, a celestial lighthouse created not by human hands, but by the collision of atmospheric forces that gather above this singular location on the planet. The phenomenon is so consistent and so violent that on some nights, lightning can be observed striking the sky at rates exceeding 280 flashes per hour, a frequency so remarkable that it seems to suggest some fundamental rule of physics is being violated or at least bent to extraordinary extremes in this one geographical location. The mechanism behind Catatumbo lightning involves a precise and rare convergence of meteorological conditions that occur almost nowhere else on Earth, beginning with warm, moist air that rises from Lake Maracaibo, colliding with cooler air masses that descend from the Andes Mountains, creating massive cumulus clouds that build vertically to extraordinary heights, sometimes reaching 20 to 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. These clouds become saturated with electrical charge through mechanisms still not completely understood by scientists, though it is believed that the movement of ice particles within the clouds, combined with the exceptional moisture content and the particular geography of the basin that traps and intensifies wind patterns, creates ideal conditions for electrical separation, where negative charges accumulate in the lower portions of clouds and positive charges gather in the upper atmosphere, generating potential differences of hundreds of millions of volts that inevitably seek to equalize through the violent release of electrical energy. What remains most striking about Catatumbo lightning is not merely that it exists, but that humanity has largely accepted its existence as merely another meteorological curiosity. A regional phenomenon to be studied and noted in scientific journals rather than recognized as a manifestation of natural forces so extreme and so concentrated that it genuinely challenges our assumptions about how evenly distributed such extreme weather phenomena should be across the planetary surface. Deep within the East African Rift Valley, straddling the border between Tanzania and Kenya, exists a body of water so chemically hostile that it appears almost otherworldly in its desolation. A sprawling alkaline lake that has earned the grim nickname of nature's death trap, where the waters themselves maintain a pH level so extreme that it would dissolve the flesh from bone, yet paradoxically supports life in ways that challenge everything we understand about habitability. Lake Natron stretches across approximately 2,000 square kilometers of barren landscape, its surface shifting between shades of rust orange, blood red, and sickly pink, depending on the angle of sunlight and the concentration of salt-loving organisms thriving within its caustic depths. And the reason for these unsettling colors lies not in minerals alone, but in billions upon billions of extremophile bacteria and algae that have evolved to thrive in conditions so severe that virtually all other forms of life have been permanently excluded from this environment. The water reaches temperatures that can exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the day, and its alkalinity climbs to levels around pH 12, creating a substance so basic that it would cause immediate chemical burns to human skin. Yet somehow within this geological hellscape, millions of flamingos arrive each year to breed, wade through the toxic waters as though they were paradise, and feed on the very organisms that thrive in this chemical nightmare. The mechanism that allows this seemingly impossible ecosystem to persist involves a remarkable evolutionary adaptation in these flamingo populations, whose specialized digestive systems and skin can tolerate the sodium carbonate and other mineral salts that would destroy other creatures, their long legs designed specifically to wade in waters too alkaline for predators to pursue them, creating a refuge unlike any other on Earth, where they gather in numbers reaching nearly 3 million at peak breeding season. What makes Lake Natron continue to persist as one of nature's most inhospitable, yet paradoxically vital ecosystems, is that despite our modern understanding of chemistry and biology, despite knowing exactly how dangerous these waters are, despite our ability to document and explain every aspect of how this lake functions, we have somehow accepted that this realm of death is simultaneously a realm of life. That the very conditions making it lethal to most organisms are the precise conditions that make it essential to those rare few species adapted to exploit it. And this contradiction between what should be possible and what actually flourishes here reminds us that our assumptions about what constitutes a habitable environment are fundamentally limited by our own biological constraints. Deep in the Fish Lake National Forest of Utah, there exists a single organism that sprawls across approximately 43,000 square miles of land, weighing nearly 13 million pounds, making it one of the heaviest living things on the entire planet. And yet most people have never heard of it because it exists as what we might call a distributed consciousness, spread across nearly 40,000 individual tree trunks that all emerge from a single unified root system beneath the forest floor. This organism is called Pando, which means I spread in Latin, and it is a clonal colony of quaking aspen trees that has been reproducing itself vegetatively for somewhere between 80,000 and 1 million years, depending on which scientific estimates you find most credible, all originating from a single male seed that took root in what is now modern-day Utah at some point in the distant prehistoric past. Each individual trunk that rises from the earth in this sprawling grove is genetically identical to every other trunk surrounding it, and they are all connected through an underground network of roots and a shared root crown system that allows them to function as a single superorganism, sharing nutrients and water resources, passing chemical signals through the soil to warn neighboring trees of insect infestations or disease, and essentially operating as one cohesive biological entity despite appearing to the casual observer as thousands of separate trees scattered across the landscape. The mechanism that allows Pando to persist in this extraordinary form is called vegetative reproduction, whereby the parent organism generates clones of itself without any genetic recombination or sexual reproduction occurring, meaning that every trunk you see is essentially an exact copy of every other trunk, all descended from that original male tree that sprouted tens of thousands of years ago. Ensuring absolute genetic uniformity across the entire colony, while also guaranteeing that the organism will never produce seeds or reproduce sexually as long as the root system remains viable and continues to generate new shoots from the soil. What makes Pando particularly remarkable is that despite being functionally immortal at the colony level due to this continuous vegetative reproduction, the individual trunks that comprise the visible portion of the organism have relatively normal lifespans for aspen trees, typically living between 100 and 150 years before dying and being replaced by new shoots emerging from the same root network, creating a constantly regenerating visible structure while the underlying root system persists unchanged and apparently indefinitely. In a remote and desolate corner of Death Valley National Park in California lies a dry lakebed known as Racetrack Playa, and across its cracked and barren surface, scattered throughout the flat expanse, are massive boulders that have somehow moved across the ground, leaving long trails of disturbed earth and stone in their wake, as though something has been dragging them across the landscape for unknown distances and unknown reasons. These are the sailing stones, and for decades, perhaps even longer, they have fascinated geologists, scientists, and casual visitors alike, because there is no obvious mechanism by which these heavy rocks, some weighing more than 700 pounds, could possibly have relocated themselves across such a vast and inhospitable terrain. The trails behind them are visible and measurable, sometimes extending for hundreds of feet, yet nobody has ever witnessed the actual movement happening, and nobody has ever caught the stones in the act of their mysterious displacement across the ancient lakebed. The phenomenon persisted as one of geology's great unsolved mysteries for nearly a century, generating theories that ranged from the plausible to the entirely fantastical, with researchers proposing everything from supernatural forces to alien intervention to explain what was clearly a physical and observable reality. What makes this phenomenon particularly compelling is the fundamental disconnect between what we can see with our own eyes, undeniable evidence of movement, and our complete inability to observe or understand the mechanism driving that movement. The stones have clearly moved, the evidence is irrefutable and permanent, yet the act itself remains invisible to human observation and understanding. In 2014, a team of researchers finally conducted a systematic study and determined that the movement occurs during winter and early spring when the lakebed floods with water, creating a shallow layer of ice that freezes at night while the ground remains wet, and during the day when temperatures warm, the ice breaks into sheets that are then pushed by wind across the wet mud, simultaneously pushing the stones along their mysterious journeys across the landscape. The explanation was mundane and entirely physical, grounded in weather patterns and basic physics, yet it had eluded comprehensive understanding for an extraordinarily long time despite being observable and accessible to anyone willing to visit and study the site. What remains remarkable is how this mystery captured human imagination for so long, how the sailing stones represented an unsolvable puzzle in our modern scientific age, and how the answer, once discovered, was both elegant and obvious, yet required patient observation and careful documentation to finally comprehend. Imagine standing on a beach at night, watching the waves roll in and break against the shore, and instead of the usual darkness of the ocean, the water glows with an ethereal blue-green light that pulses and flows with each movement of the tide, creating an almost otherworldly display that seems to defy the natural order of things. Yet this phenomenon is entirely real and occurs in specific locations around the world, where conditions align perfectly for millions of dinoflagellates and other bioluminescent organisms to create this mesmerizing spectacle. These tiny creatures, microscopic in individual size yet staggering in collective numbers, possess the remarkable ability to produce their own light through a chemical reaction similar to that of fireflies, a process called chemiluminescence, where luciferin and luciferase proteins interact to emit photons of blue light, a survival mechanism that evolved over millions of years to help these organisms attract predators that would eat the things trying to eat them. Essentially using light as a form of biological warfare in the microscopic arms race of the ocean. When waves crash and disturb the water, these organisms are triggered by the physical agitation and pressure changes to illuminate simultaneously, creating waves of light that seem to follow the physics of water itself, and visitors to places like Puerto Rico, New Zealand, and the coast of California have witnessed this natural display where the boundary between ocean and sky becomes indistinguishable, where the waves appear to carry liquid starlight in their foam, and where the usual rules of nocturnal darkness seem suspended entirely. The remarkable aspect is that despite our scientific understanding of the mechanism behind bioluminescence, despite knowing exactly which proteins are responsible and how the chemical cascade functions, we have somehow allowed this knowledge to diminish rather than enhance our sense of wonder, as if understanding the how makes the what less miraculous. And yet the sheer improbability remains unchanged, the fact that single-celled organisms develop the capacity for light production. That they congregate in such numbers that their combined emission becomes visible to the human eye, that coastal conditions must align precisely with breeding cycles and water temperature and nutrient levels and darkness at exactly the right moment. All of these factors converging to create something that feels more like magic than biology, and we continue to stand on those beaches, phones in hand, trying to capture something that cannot truly be captured. Accepting this astonishing reality with the same casual acknowledgement we reserve for sunset, normalizing the extraordinary simply because it happens to occur within nature's framework rather than human invention. Deep beneath the arid landscapes of East Africa, in the underground tunnel systems of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, there exists a creature so fundamentally different from nearly all other mammals that scientists have struggled for decades to classify it within our conventional understanding of animal biology. And this creature is the naked mole rat, a small rodent that appears almost alien in its appearance with wrinkled, translucent pink skin that seems barely attached to its skeletal frame. Small beady eyes that are nearly useless in the darkness of their subterranean world, and a body that seems completely unsuited for survival in the harsh above-ground environment where almost every other mammal thrives. What makes the naked mole rat truly extraordinary, however, is not merely its unusual appearance, but rather the absolutely revolutionary way in which it has evolved to organize its entire society and biology around principles that contradict everything we thought we knew about how mammals function. For unlike virtually every other mammal on Earth, the naked mole rat is eusocial, meaning it lives in colonies with a strict hierarchical structure much more similar to that of honeybees or ant colonies than to any traditional mammalian social order, with a single breeding female, called the queen, who is the only individual in the entire colony permitted to reproduce, while all other members, both male and female, are sterile workers who exist solely to serve the queen's reproductive needs and the colony's collective survival. The psychological mechanism that allows this behavior to persist is rooted in a combination of genetic predisposition and chemical signaling, as the queen produces pheromones that actively suppress the reproductive systems of all subordinate females, essentially chemically castrating them into a state of permanent infertility. And this chemical domination is so complete that workers seem to have evolved no internal drive to reproduce independently, instead deriving their sense of purpose and social fulfillment from their roles within the colony structure, whether that role involves caring for the queen's offspring, excavating and maintaining the tunnel systems, or defending the colony from threats. Yet perhaps even more astonishingly, the naked mole rat has also evolved an almost complete resistance to cancer, possessing a remarkable cellular mechanism that prevents tumors from forming, along with an extraordinary tolerance for pain, unable to feel the burning sensation of capsaicin that causes all other mammals to experience intense discomfort. And these biological adaptations seem to have emerged not as random mutations, but as direct consequences of their eusocial lifestyle, where the cooperative pressures of colonial living have somehow selected for traits that would normally be disadvantageous in traditional mammals, but are profoundly beneficial when thousands of individuals must live in impossibly close quarters for their entire lives. Deep within the coral reefs and rocky crevices of tropical and subtropical oceans, there exists a creature so visually extraordinary and neurologically complex that it seems almost impossibly designed by nature itself. And this creature is the mantis shrimp, a marine animal that possesses sensory and physical capabilities so far beyond what most other creatures can perceive or accomplish that scientists have spent decades simply trying to understand how such abilities could have evolved in the first place. The mantis shrimp, which is neither a true mantis nor a shrimp, but rather a unique crustacean called a stomatopod, is small in body size, typically ranging from just 3 inches to nearly a foot in length depending on the species, yet despite its modest dimensions, this animal has become one of the most celebrated and studied creatures in marine biology due to its genuinely supernatural sensory apparatus and its devastating predatory capabilities that seem almost comically disproportionate to its tiny frame. The most astounding feature of the mantis shrimp is its visual system, which is fundamentally different from that of almost every other animal on Earth, as while human eyes contain 3 types of color receptors that allow us to see the visible spectrum of light, the mantis shrimp possesses between 12 and 16 types of photoreceptors, depending on the species, granting it the ability to see colors that exist entirely beyond human comprehension, including ultraviolet light, visible light, and polarized light all at once in a simultaneous sensory experience that our brains could never process or even imagine. This means that the mantis shrimp observes the ocean world in colors that do not have names in any human language, experiencing visual information so rich and layered that if a human could somehow perceive what the mantis shrimp perceives, our minds would struggle to process the overwhelming flood of chromatic data pouring in from every direction at every moment. Beyond its eyes, the mantis shrimp is perhaps most famous for its raptorial claws, which are among the fastest moving limbs in the animal kingdom, capable of accelerating to speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour in a fraction of a millisecond, generating forces equivalent to the impact of a bullet fired from a small caliber handgun, creating shock waves and cavitation bubbles in the water that can stun or kill prey from a distance without even making direct contact. A hunting strategy so effective that the mantis shrimp can strike with deadly precision in the murky depths where vision alone might be insufficient for most predators. Deep within the ocean, in the twilight zones where sunlight barely penetrates and pressure crushes most creatures into submission, there exists a small shrimp no larger than your thumb that possesses one of the most violent and destructive biological weapons known to marine science, a phenomenon so extreme that it creates bubbles of such intensity they generate temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun itself. The pistol shrimp, scientifically known as Alpheus or Synalpheus depending on the specific species, has evolved a specialized claw that functions as a biological gun, capable of snapping shut with such tremendous acceleration and force that it creates a cavitation bubble, which is essentially a void of emptiness that implodes with cataclysmic violence when the pressure differential becomes too great. When this bubble collapses, it produces a shockwave so powerful that it stuns or kills prey organisms in the immediate vicinity, and during this process, the temperatures within the collapsing bubble momentarily reach approximately 5,000 degrees Kelvin, which is roughly equivalent to the surface temperature of our own sun, despite occurring in the cold darkness of the deep ocean. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in fluid dynamics and the principles of cavitation, wherein a rapid change in pressure causes dissolved gases within the water to form bubbles. And as these bubbles move from a low-pressure zone into a higher-pressure zone, they collapse with such violence that the energy released generates an intense plasma, a state of matter where electrons are stripped from atoms, creating this impossibly hot microenvironment that exists for only fractions of a microsecond before dissipating. What makes this even more remarkable is that the pistol shrimp produces this effect deliberately and repeatedly, using it as a hunting strategy with such precision and control that it can aim the shockwave towards specific prey, seemingly defying the notion that such extreme physics should be relegated to laboratories and industrial applications rather than the hunting habits of a creature that weighs mere grams. The shrimp has somehow evolved protective adaptations to shield itself from the blast it creates, developing hardened structures and specialized tissues that can withstand the acoustic shock waves that accompany each snap, allowing it to fire its biological plasma weapon again and again without suffering the very damage it inflicts upon its prey. Yet despite the utterly fantastical nature of this ability, despite the sheer impossibility of a small ocean creature harnessing the temperature of stars in a controlled biological process, this phenomenon persists in our oceans unnoticed and unremarkable to most of humanity, normalized into obscurity by the simple fact that it occurs in darkness far from human observation, allowing one of nature's most violent and extraordinary weapons to remain a quiet, persistent reality in the deep. Deep within the murky freshwater rivers of South America, particularly throughout the Amazon and Orinoco basins, exists a creature so bizarre in its capabilities that it seems to defy the basic laws of nature itself. Yet it remains one of the most real and thoroughly documented organisms on our planet. The electric eel, which is not actually an eel at all, but rather a type of knife fish, possesses the remarkable ability to generate and discharge electrical currents of startling magnitude, producing shocks of up to 860 volts, with currents measuring several amperes, making it one of the most electrically powerful animals in existence. These creatures, which can grow up to 6 feet in length and weigh as much as 40 pounds, have evolved an entire biological system dedicated to electricity generation, with approximately 80% of their body composed of specialized electric organs called the main organ, the hunter's organ, and the Sach's organ, each functioning as biological batteries that work in concert to produce these extraordinary electrical discharges. The mechanism behind this phenomenon relies on thousands upon thousands of specialized cells called electrocytes stacked in series like biological batteries, each cell capable of generating a small electrical potential difference, and when fired in synchronization, they create cumulative voltages powerful enough to stun fish, incapacitate predators, and even pose a genuine threat to human beings who encounter them. The electric eel employs these shocks for multiple purposes, including navigation through murky waters, communication with other eels, hunting and immobilizing prey, and most crucially, defense against predators, with the animal capable of producing high-voltage discharges in rapid succession to ensure the complete incapacitation of threats. Yet what makes this creature even more remarkable is that it has somehow maintained this extraordinary ability across millions of years of evolution without any external changes to its basic body plan, as if nature developed this biological weapon system and saw absolutely no reason to modify or simplify it. We have grown so accustomed to the existence of the electric eel that we rarely pause to consider just how absolutely improbable its existence truly is. How a fish with the capability to generate hundreds of volts of electricity swims through our world as casually as any other animal. How predators have learned to avoid it despite its lethal capabilities. And how the ecosystem has adapted around this single remarkable creature that functions like a living electrical grid. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon have long understood the danger these creatures pose, and modern scientists continue to study the electric eel's nervous system to unlock secrets about bioelectricity that might one day revolutionize human medicine and technology. Deep within the rainforests of Central and South America, there exists a family of frogs so transparent that their internal organs are completely visible to the naked eye, and these remarkable creatures are called glass frogs, which represent one of nature's most counterintuitive survival strategies that seems to defy every principle of animal camouflage and predator avoidance that we understand. When you observe a glass frog clinging to a leaf in the darkness of the forest canopy, you are witnessing something that appears fundamentally illogical from an evolutionary perspective. because instead of hiding themselves through concealment, these frogs have evolved to become nearly invisible by achieving absolute transparency, allowing you to see directly through their bodies to the leaf beneath them, which means their skin, bones, organs, and tissues have all adapted to transmit light rather than absorb or reflect it, making them vanish against the vegetation they rest upon. The mechanism behind this extraordinary adaptation involves several biological processes working in concert, including specialized skin cells that contain fewer pigments than other frogs possess, a liver that can shift position to avoid casting a shadow that would betray the frog's presence, and a unique arrangement of reflective proteins in their skin that bend light in such a way that the frog's body becomes optically indistinguishable from its background. Yet what makes this strategy even more psychologically fascinating is that these frogs have essentially chosen invisibility over the traditional methods of defense that other amphibians employ, such as toxins, camouflage coloration, or even the ability to flee quickly, which suggests that remaining perfectly still and perfectly transparent while resting on a leaf has proven more effective for survival than any other strategy available to them. The fact that this trait persists across multiple species of glass frogs, and that it has been refined and maintained through millions of years of evolution, speaks to how thoroughly this adaptation has proven its worth in the specific ecological niche these frogs occupy. And yet for the human observer, the existence of glass frogs seems to challenge our intuitions about how animals should hide, because we expect camouflage to involve matching colors or patterns rather than vanishing entirely. And we expect predators to hunt by sight, but glass frogs demonstrate that transparency itself can be the ultimate form of visual concealment, which reveals something profound about how we have normalized certain ways of thinking about survival while overlooking the radical solutions that nature has already discovered. Deep within the eucalyptus forests of southeastern Australia exists a bird so extraordinarily gifted at vocal imitation that it has become nearly impossible to distinguish its calls from the actual sounds of its environment. And this creature, known as the lyrebird, possesses a vocal apparatus so sophisticated and neurologically wired for sound replication that it can reproduce not only the calls of dozens of other bird species with perfect accuracy, but also the mechanical sounds of chainsaws, car alarms, camera shutters, and human speech, with an uncanny precision that borders on the surreal. The lyrebird's ability stems from a combination of anatomical advantages and learned behavior, as the bird possesses an extremely complex syrinx, which is the avian equivalent of the human larynx, and this dual-chambered vocal organ allows the lyrebird to produce two entirely different sounds simultaneously, creating harmonies and layered calls that no other bird can achieve. While its brain contains an enlarged song control region that processes auditory information with remarkable detail and stores these acoustic memories with extraordinary fidelity. The mechanism behind this mimicry is rooted in the lyrebird's evolutionary history as a ground-dwelling, relatively solitary species that relied on vocal recognition and territorial display to establish dominance and attract mates. And over countless generations, the birds that could most convincingly replicate the sounds around them gained competitive advantages, as they could confuse rivals, deceive potential predators, and demonstrate cognitive superiority that impressed potential partners, thus encoding this remarkable ability deeper and deeper into the species' genetic and developmental blueprint. What makes this phenomenon particularly astonishing is that the lyrebird does not merely parrot back sounds in a mechanical fashion, but rather integrates these mimicked vocalizations into complex, structured songs that can last for hours, weaving together a tapestry of borrowed calls that are organized with such artistic intention that they appear to tell a story or express emotion. And yet, despite possessing this seemingly impossible talent, the lyrebird remains relatively unknown to most of the world. Its extraordinary abilities confined to the remote forests where it lives, and we have normalized this impossibility simply by accepting it as a product of nature. A reminder that evolution has had millions of years to craft abilities that seem to defy our understanding of what should be physically and neurologically possible. Yet perhaps this very obscurity is fitting, for in a world obsessed with documenting and cataloging the extraordinary, the lyrebird's mastery reminds us that the most profound miracles often perform in solitude, witnessed only by those patient enough to venture into the quiet places where nature conducts its most intricate experiments. Deep within the forest floor, hidden beneath decaying leaves and rotting wood, exists a creature so alien and yet so fundamentally intelligent that it challenges everything we thought we knew about what consciousness actually requires, and that creature is the slime mold, a single-celled organism that, despite lacking a brain, neurons, or any recognizable cognitive apparatus whatsoever, demonstrates problem-solving abilities that rival those of creatures millions of years more evolutionarily advanced than itself. In laboratory experiments conducted over the past 2 decades, researchers have placed slime molds, particularly the species Physarum polycephalum, in maze-like structures with food sources at various exits, and what they discovered was nothing short of astonishing. The slime mold would explore the maze methodically, finding the shortest path to the food with remarkable efficiency, and when researchers modified the maze or changed the location of food sources, the organism would adapt its route accordingly, effectively learning and remembering spatial information. The mechanism behind this impossible intelligence appears to operate through a process of chemical signaling and network optimization, where the slime mold extends itself through branching tubes of protoplasm, and as it explores, it reinforces the pathways that lead toward nutrient-rich areas while simultaneously withdrawing from dead ends, creating what amounts to a distributed computing system where the entire organism functions as both the processor and the memory storage, without any centralized control center whatsoever. What makes this phenomenon even more remarkable is that slime molds have been observed solving problems that humans would need mathematics to calculate, such as optimizing networks in ways that mirror Tokyo's railway system, and when presented with multiple food sources arranged in patterns, they consistently choose routes that minimize energy expenditure while maximizing nutrient acquisition. Yet despite possessing this extraordinary distributed intelligence, the slime mold operates with complete neural absence, suggesting that intelligence itself is not an emergent property requiring biological complexity, but rather a fundamental principle that can manifest through any system capable of sensing its environment and responding adaptively to stimuli, a concept so profound that it forces us to reconsider the very definition of what thinking actually means. Perhaps most unsettling to our anthropocentric worldview is the implication that intelligence may not require consciousness at all, and that a microscopic blob of protoplasm navigating a petri dish might possess a form of problem-solving wisdom that transcends our narrow definitions of mind, suggesting that the universe contains far more varieties of thinking than our brains have yet evolved the capacity to recognize. If you were to take Saturn, that magnificent ringed giant with its pale golden hue and intricate system of icy bands encircling its equator, and somehow place it into a bathtub filled with water, or more realistically, into a cosmic ocean of hypothetical proportions, it would sink no further than the surface, bobbing there like an enormous cork adrift in an endless sea. This is not a metaphor or a poetic exaggeration, but rather a physical reality rooted in the fundamental properties of density and buoyancy that govern how objects interact with fluids. Saturn, despite being incomprehensibly massive with a diameter nearly 10 times that of Earth and containing enough material to equal 95 Earth's worth of mass, possesses an average density of only 0.687 grams per cubic centimeter, which is substantially less dense than water itself at 1 gram per cubic centimeter. This extraordinary condition exists because Saturn is not a solid terrestrial world like our own planet, but rather a gas giant composed primarily of hydrogen and helium, elements that remain gaseous even under the extreme pressures found within its upper atmosphere, creating a world that is fundamentally less compact and more diffuse than liquid water. The mechanism behind this counterintuitive property stems from Saturn's formation in the outer regions of our solar system, where temperatures were cold enough to preserve lightweight volatile compounds, rather than allowing them to condense into rock and metal, as occurred with the terrestrial planets closer to the Sun. What makes this fact particularly striking to contemplate is how it challenges our fundamental intuitions about size and weight, the sense we have developed through living on a solid world where larger objects are invariably heavier and denser. Yet Saturn defies this expectation entirely through the sheer abundance of light gases contained within its spherical envelope. We rarely pause to consider how profoundly different the rules of existence become in the outer solar system, where the very concept of a solid surface becomes almost meaningless, and where a planet can be simultaneously the second largest body orbiting our sun while being less dense than the water in our oceans, Yet this remarkable reality persists as an established scientific fact, known and accepted, but somehow rarely contemplated with the wonder it deserves. Consider that if a comparable volume of lead or iron were somehow suspended in that same hypothetical cosmic ocean, it would plummet instantly to the depths. Yet Saturn's gaseous composition grants it a buoyancy that defies the expectation we hold for objects of such staggering scale, reminding us that the universe's most fundamental properties often operate according to principles entirely divorced from our everyday experience on solid ground. Imagine a world where a single day lasts longer than an entire year, where the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, where the atmosphere is so thick and hostile that it would crush and incinerate you within moments, and where time itself seems to move backwards relative to everything we understand about planetary rotation. This is Venus, our neighboring planet, and the concept of a Venusian day represents one of the most profoundly disorienting realities in our solar system. A day on Venus, defined as the time it takes for the planet to complete one full rotation on its axis, requires 243 Earth days to accomplish, while a Venusian year, the time it takes to orbit the Sun, requires only 225 Earth days. This means that on Venus, a year actually passes before a single day concludes, creating a temporal paradox that seems to violate our most basic intuitions about how celestial bodies should behave. The mechanism behind this bizarre reality stems from Venus's extraordinarily slow axial rotation combined with its relatively close orbit to the Sun, a combination that emerged from the violent planetary formation processes billions of years ago, possibly including massive impacts that dramatically slowed the planet's spin. Furthermore, Venus rotates backwards compared to most planets in our solar system, a phenomenon called retrograde rotation, meaning that if you could somehow stand on Venus's surface and watch the sky, you would see the sun moving from west to east rather than east to west as it does on Earth. The atmospheric conditions that create this hostile environment are themselves a product of a runaway greenhouse effect, where carbon dioxide accumulated in such massive quantities that surface temperatures reached 900 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead. Despite these extreme and logically comprehensible physical explanations rooted in planetary science and celestial mechanics, the Venusian day persists as a concept that our minds struggle to fully integrate, perhaps because we have spent our entire evolutionary history on a planet where days and years follow intuitive patterns, where one day lasts approximately 24 hours and 1 year requires approximately 365 days. Establishing mental templates that Venus systematically violates in ways both subtle and profound. The cognitive dissonance deepens when we consider that a Venusian observer would experience sunset before sunrise, watching the sun complete its journey across the sky over the course of months, transforming what we regard as an instantaneous celestial event into a protracted, almost geological process. In this way, Venus invites us to recognize that our experience of time and planetary cycles is not universal, but rather a peculiar gift of our position in the solar system, a reminder that the universe operates according to principles far stranger than our earthbound intuitions prepare us to comprehend. Every single year, the moon moves away from the Earth by approximately 3.8 centimeters, which translates to roughly 1.5 inches annually, a process that has been occurring for billions of years and will continue for billions more into the distant future. This means that the moon you see in the sky tonight is not in the same position it occupied when your parents were born, and the moon that greeted your ancestors thousands of years ago hung noticeably closer to our planet, appearing larger and more imposing in their night skies than it does in ours. The mechanism driving this gradual recession involves tidal forces and the transfer of angular momentum between our planet and its natural satellite, where the moon's gravitational pull creates tidal bulges on Earth's surface. And as our planet rotates faster than the moon orbits, these bulges are carried ahead of the moon's position, creating a gravitational drag that gradually slows Earth's rotation while simultaneously pushing the moon into a higher orbit. This is a fundamental consequence of orbital mechanics and gravitational interaction, completely real and mathematically predictable, something that our most precise instruments and calculations confirm with remarkable accuracy. Yet despite this knowledge existing squarely within the realm of established physics and observable reality, there remains something profoundly unsettling about contemplating the slow, unstoppable drift of our closest celestial companion away from us, a movement so gradual that no human lifetime contains enough of it to perceive directly, And perhaps that is precisely why this fact remains so easily forgotten or pushed to the margins of our collective consciousness. We have normalized the moon's presence as permanent and unchanging, a constant guardian in our sky, and the notion that it is perpetually receding, that our connection to it is measured in centimeters of increasing distance, somehow manages to persist as overlooked despite being neither hidden nor controversial, simply a quiet reality unfolding across timescales that dwarf human experience and concern. In billions of years, the moon will drift so far that total solar eclipses will become impossible, those rare moments of cosmic alignment that have inspired wonder and terror throughout human history simply ceasing to occur for our descendants. A loss we cannot mourn because we will never witness it, yet another consequence of deep time that reshapes the world in ways both magnificent and melancholy. And perhaps this is the moon's greatest gift to us, not its constancy, but its impermanence, a reminder that even the most reliable fixtures of our existence are subject to change, that the universe operates on scales so vast our species is merely a brief witness to its transformations, and that the things we assume will always be there are already, in their own patient way, saying goodbye. Every single year, Mount Everest becomes measurably taller, growing at a rate of approximately 4 millimeters annually, which means that the world's highest mountain is constantly pushing upward into the atmosphere in a process that continues regardless of whether anyone is climbing it or not. This growth occurs due to the collision of the Indian tectonic plate with the Eurasian plate, a geological process that began millions of years ago and shows absolutely no signs of stopping, as the Indian plate continues its relentless northward movement at a rate of about 2 centimeters per year, driving the mountain higher and higher with each passing decade. The mountain's growth is not uniform across its entire structure, and different measurement techniques have occasionally revealed variations in how much taller it actually gets. Yet the fundamental reality remains that Everest is engaged in a continuous, slow-motion ascent that will persist for millions of years into the future, unless some catastrophic geological event fundamentally alters the landscape of Asia. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is that humans have become accustomed to viewing mountains as static, unchanging landmarks that represent permanence and stability in our world. Yet here we have the planet's most iconic peak literally growing taller with each passing moment, defying our intuitive sense that mountains are ancient, unchanging monuments frozen in time. We have normalized the reality that our most celebrated geographical feature is in constant flux, that climbers who summit Everest today are technically standing on a mountain that is taller than the one their predecessors climbed decades earlier, and that future generations will find themselves ascending an even more imposing peak. This gradual, imperceptible growth continues to occur despite our complete inability to perceive it in real time, a reminder that planetary processes operate on timescales so vast that they escape our sensory perception. Yet the mathematics and geological evidence confirm with absolute certainty that Mount Everest is not the static monument we imagine it to be, but rather a dynamic feature of a living, shifting Earth. The implications of this perpetual growth extend beyond mere geological curiosity, as it fundamentally reshapes our understanding of the relationship between human ambition and planetary timescales. We climb mountains that are literally climbing themselves, pursuing summits that shift imperceptibly even as we stand upon them, embodying our eternal struggle against a world that refuses to remain still. Yet this same geological process that elevates Everest also destabilizes it, as the constant tectonic pressure creates fractures and weaknesses in the mountain's structure, meaning that the very forces driving its growth simultaneously accelerate its erosion, a paradox in which creation and destruction operate as two sides of the same planetary mechanism. Beneath the forest floor exists an intricate network of fungal filaments so vast and complex that scientists have begun to understand it as nothing less than a living nervous system connecting thousands of individual trees across entire ecosystems. And through this underground web of mycelial threads, trees actively transmit chemical signals, nutrients, and warning messages to one another in ways that defy our traditional understanding of plant biology and intelligence. When a tree is attacked by insects or diseased by pathogens, it does not simply suffer in isolation. Instead, it releases chemical signals that travel through the fungal network to neighboring trees, which then strengthen their own chemical defenses in preparation for the same threat, a phenomenon that researchers have documented through careful laboratory experiments and field studies conducted over decades of dedicated observation. The fungal partners in this relationship, primarily mycorrhizal fungi that form symbiotic associations with tree roots, appear to benefit from this arrangement by receiving sugars and carbohydrates from the tree's photosynthetic processes, while the trees gain access to nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that the fungi extract from decomposing organic matter in the soil. This underground trading system operates continuously, with trees even capable of sending resources through the network to support younger, weaker, or more heavily damaged trees within their vicinity, as if the forest possessed some form of collective survival instinct working toward the preservation of the entire woodland community. Yet despite the mounting evidence from peer-reviewed research and the growing recognition among forest ecologists that these communication networks represent a genuine form of biological organization, the phenomenon remains poorly understood in mainstream consciousness, and many people continue to move through forests entirely unaware that the silent trees around them are engaged in constant conversation. Sharing information about threats and resources with the same gravity and complexity that characterizes animal societies we consider obviously sentient. The mechanism behind this communication relies on the chemical language that all living things understand, the same molecular vocabulary that governs life at every scale, and yet somehow the reality that plants possess this capacity still strikes us as almost mystical, a remnant of ancient folklore dressed up in modern scientific terminology. Perhaps what feels mystical is simply the recognition that intelligence and communication need not resemble our own to be profoundly real, and that the forest's quiet conversation has been occurring for millions of years, patient and constant, long before we developed the instruments sophisticated enough to finally overhear it. Imagine standing in the heart of the Sahara Desert today, surrounded by endless golden dunes and the kind of heat that makes mirages shimmer on the horizon, and then consider that just 6,000 years ago, this exact landscape was covered in lush green vegetation, with lakes dotting the terrain and grasslands stretching across what is now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The Sahara was genuinely green, not in some distant prehistoric era when dinosaurs roamed the planet, but within the timeframe of human civilization, during a period called the African Humid Period, when monsoon rains swept across North Africa with such regularity and intensity that they transformed the desert into savanna and wetlands that could sustain large populations of animals and thriving human settlements. Archaeological evidence, including rock paintings, fossilized pollen, and ancient lake beds, confirms that elephants, giraffes, hippopotamuses, and crocodiles all lived where today you would find nothing but sand and the occasional hardy desert plant struggling to survive on minimal water. The mechanism behind this dramatic transformation lies in something called orbital precession, a slow wobble in the Earth's axial tilt that occurs over cycles spanning thousands of years, which alters the intensity and pattern of seasonal monsoons across different latitudes. And during certain periods in our planet's recent history, these monsoon patterns shifted dramatically enough to deliver substantial rainfall to the Sahara region, fundamentally changing its entire ecosystem and climate. Then, roughly 5,000 years ago, this pattern reversed, and the monsoons retreated once more, leaving behind a gradually drying landscape that over centuries and millennia became the vast desert we know today. A transformation so complete that it seems almost impossible that the same land could have supported such biodiversity and human thriving. What persists as genuinely remarkable is not merely that this change occurred, but that we live in a time period where the Sahara remains locked in its dry state, and few people walking across or flying over these dunes ever consider that beneath the sand lies evidence of a radically different world, that human beings lived and built civilizations in places that are now utterly uninhabitable, and that this shift happened not over millions of years, but within a time span short enough that, if humans kept detailed written records at that time, we might have accounts of the transformation itself, stories of how the rains stopped coming and the green slowly faded away. Some scholars theorize that this climate shift may have even influenced human migration patterns, pushing populations northward toward the Mediterranean and southward into sub-Saharan Africa, potentially reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of the entire continent in ways we are still working to fully understand. Every single year, millions of tons of dust particles lift off from the Sahara Desert in North Africa, carried upward by thermal winds and convection currents that rise from the scorching sand below, and these dust particles travel thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean in massive plumes that can be seen from space, eventually settling over the Amazon rainforest in South America, where they deliver crucial nutrients to one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The mechanism behind this extraordinary phenomenon begins with the geology of the Sahara itself, which contains phosphorus-rich soils that have been weathered and broken down into fine particles over millions of years. And when dust storms sweep across the desert during spring and summer months, these particles become suspended in the atmosphere at altitudes where trade winds can catch them and propel them westward. The Amazon rainforest, despite its lush appearance and apparent abundance, actually grows in soil that is relatively poor in certain essential nutrients, particularly phosphorus, which plants require for energy transfer and growth, and the rainforest's ecosystem has evolved over millennia to cycle nutrients so efficiently that it has adapted to survive in this nutrient-limited environment. When the Saharan dust arrives across the Atlantic after a journey of 5 to 7 days, it deposits an estimated 27 million tons of phosphorus and other minerals annually onto the canopy and soil of the Amazon, providing a natural fertilization system that directly supports the forest's productivity and the survival of countless plant and animal species that depend on it. What makes this process so remarkable is that despite being separated by an entire ocean and existing on different continents, these two ecosystems have become fundamentally interconnected through atmospheric transport, yet most people live their entire lives completely unaware that the health of the world's largest rainforest depends significantly on dust from one of the world's largest deserts. This relationship has persisted for thousands of years, long before humans recognized it or understood its importance, and it demonstrates how planetary systems operate at scales so vast that they transcend our normal comprehension, creating dependencies and connections that seem almost impossible until you understand the simple physics involved. And yet we continue to treat these ecosystems as if they are isolated and independent, rather than as deeply woven parts of a global biological and atmospheric network. The disruption of this ancient cycle through climate change and desertification, expanding Saharan boundaries and altering dust transport patterns, threatens to destabilize a system that has sustained the Amazon for millennia, reminding us that even the most robust natural processes are vulnerable to the cascading effects of environmental transformation. Somewhere in the depths of the Pacific Ocean, there exists a whale that has spent decades calling out into the void, and no other whale has ever answered. In 1989, marine biologists first detected an unusual acoustic signature being transmitted through underwater hydrophone networks, a sound that repeated with remarkable consistency, yet bore no resemblance to any known whale species in the ocean. The frequency was approximately 52 Hz, which placed it between the low rumbling calls of blue whales and the higher-pitched songs of fin whales, making it utterly incompatible with the communication systems of any living cetacean population. Year after year, researchers tracked this solitary vocalization as it traveled thousands of miles across the ocean, always alone, always unanswered, and the whale behind that voice became known to the scientific community as the 52 Hz whale. The creature, despite being a massive marine mammal that should have been part of a complex social structure, appeared to be utterly isolated from every other member of its kind, calling out with what seemed like an almost desperate rhythm, repeating its unique song in patterns that suggested intention and perhaps even longing. Scientists have proposed numerous theories about why this whale sings alone. It could be deaf or partially deaf, unable to hear the responses of others. It could be a hybrid between two species, genetically incompatible with either population. It could be the last surviving member of an extinct subspecies, or it could simply be an individual with a naturally unusual voice that renders it unable to communicate with its own kind. The profound melancholy of the situation resonates deeply with human observers, who have projected onto this whale a narrative of isolation and sorrow that mirrors our own fears of disconnection. We have created documentaries, written songs, and told the story of the loneliest whale repeatedly, turning a genuine biological anomaly into a symbol of profound loneliness, and yet the whale continues to sing into the darkness, whether or not it experiences anything resembling human emotion. The persistence of this story, decades after its initial discovery, speaks to something fundamental in how we understand isolation and connection, suggesting that the concept of being truly alone in an otherwise populated world contains a power that transcends the boundaries between species and speaks to the deepest anxieties of conscious existence itself. Perhaps what makes the 52 Hertz whale so compelling is that it forces us to confront the limits of our empathy. We cannot know if the whale suffers from its isolation, yet we cannot help but imagine that it does, and in that gap between biological fact and emotional projection lies the true source of our fascination with its endless, unanswered song. Deep beneath the surface of the western Pacific Ocean, at a location approximately 200 kilometers east of the Philippines, exists a geological formation so extreme that it represents one of the most hostile environments known to exist anywhere on our planet. A place where the pressure is nearly 11,000 times greater than what we experience at sea level, where the temperature hovers just above freezing, where absolute darkness reigns perpetually, and where the human body would be crushed instantaneously if exposed to these conditions without protection. Yet this place is real and measurable and has been visited by only a handful of humans in all of recorded history. The Mariana Trench descends to a depth of approximately 7 miles, or nearly 37,000 feet, making it the deepest oceanic formation that we know of, a chasm so profound that if you were to somehow submerge Mount Everest into its depths, the summit would still be covered by more than a mile of water, and yet despite this incomprehensible extremity, life somehow persists in these crushing abysses. With bizarre creatures that have adapted so completely to these conditions that they would likely perish if brought to the surface, organisms with bodies designed specifically to withstand pressures that should theoretically be impossible to survive, yet they thrive there in the darkness. What makes the Mariana Trench particularly remarkable is that we have spent more resources and effort exploring the surface of the moon than we have exploring the deepest parts of our own ocean. And there remain vast stretches of the trench floor that have never been observed or documented by any human being or any instrument that humans have created. Meaning that somewhere in those depths exist unknown species and geological formations that remain completely unmapped and uncharacterized, despite the fact that we live on a planet where we possess the technological capability to reach these places if we chose to do so. The trench continues to persist in our imagination as a symbol of the ultimate frontier, a place that somehow feels more alien and more distant than space itself. And yet it exists here on Earth, in waters that cover most of our world, a reminder that the vastness and strangeness of our own planet remains fundamentally incomprehensible to us, that we have only barely begun to understand the world we inhabit. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson the Mariana Trench offers us. That wonder and mystery persist not in distant galaxies or remote mountaintops, but in the depths beneath our feet, waiting in the darkness for those brave or curious enough to seek them out, reminding us that exploration and discovery remain eternally possible on our own world. Yet even as we stand on the precipice of understanding these abyssal depths, we must acknowledge that our very attempts to explore them risk altering or destroying the delicate ecosystems that have evolved in isolation for millions of years. Picture yourself floating above one of the most mesmerizing geological formations on Earth, a perfect circular void in the shallow waters of the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Belize, where the seafloor drops away into absolute darkness in a formation so geometrically precise it almost seems impossible that nature could have created something so perfectly circular and so deeply unsettling to witness from above. The Great Blue Hole is approximately 984 feet across and 407 feet deep, a massive sinkhole that formed during the Pleistocene epoch when sea levels were considerably lower than they are today, back when this wasn't a hole beneath the ocean at all, but rather a cave system carved into limestone bedrock by the relentless flow of water through soluble rock over tens of thousands of years. When the Ice Age ended and the oceans rose, the cave system flooded completely, but its entrance collapsed inward, leaving behind this otherworldly chasm that appears on every satellite image and aerial photograph as a dark, ominous circle surrounded by brilliant turquoise water, creating a visual contrast so stark that it seems to pull at something deep within the human consciousness. Scientists exploring the depths have discovered that the hole contains several smaller caves and formations, that the bottom is covered in hydrogen sulfide deposits that create an anaerobic environment where almost no life can survive, and that stalactites hanging from the cave ceiling tell the story of when this place was a dry cavern above sea level, now submerged and untouched by sunlight in the perpetual darkness of the deep water. What's remarkable about the Great Blue Hole is how it has become one of the most sought-after diving destinations in the world, despite its inherent danger, and despite the fact that most people will never actually visit it. Yet it captures our imagination so completely through photographs and footage that it has achieved a kind of mythical status in popular culture, becoming a symbol of the unknown and the unknowable that exists even in our modern age of technological exploration and mapping. We have documented it completely, we understand its geological origins, we know what lives and dies within it, and yet something about its perfect circularity and its depth continues to unsettle us, suggesting that knowing the facts about something doesn't necessarily diminish its capacity to inspire awe or even a subtle sense of dread when we contemplate the darkness waiting at its bottom. Perhaps this is why the Great Blue Hole endures as a modern wonder, not despite our scientific understanding of it, but because it represents a threshold between the mapped and the mysterious, a place where human knowledge meets the limits of human experience, and where the act of looking down into that perfect darkness reminds us that the Earth still contains secrets vast enough to humble us. Deep within the vast expanse of the Mauritanian desert, roughly 400 kilometers east of the capital city of Nouakchott, there exists a geological formation so perfectly circular and so geometrically precise that it appears almost impossible that nature could have created it without the deliberate intervention of human hands. Yet this structure, known as the Richat structure, or more commonly called the Eye of Sahara, is entirely the product of natural geological processes that have unfolded over millions of years. The formation itself spans approximately 50 kilometers in diameter and consists of concentric rings of rock that seem to radiate outward from a central point, creating the uncanny illusion of a massive eye staring up at the sky. And when viewed from satellite imagery, the resemblance to an actual eye becomes so striking that for decades, astronauts and cosmonauts routinely used this formation as a landmark for navigation and orientation during their missions to space. The Eye of Sahara was formed through a complex process of dome uplift and subsequent erosion, wherein ancient sedimentary rocks were pushed upward by geological forces deep beneath the Earth's surface, creating a bulging dome-like structure that was then systematically worn away by wind, rain, and weathering over the course of millions of years, exposing the harder and softer rock layers in alternating bands that create those distinctive concentric circles. The psychological mechanism that makes this formation so captivating to human observers is rooted in our inherent tendency to recognize and interpret patterns, particularly patterns that resemble living things or familiar objects, a phenomenon known as pareidolia, which explains why we see faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, and in this case, a giant eye watching over an empty desert. Our brains are evolutionarily wired to detect faces and eyes because such recognition was critical for survival, allowing our ancestors to quickly identify potential threats or allies in their environment. And this deep neurological inclination persists in modern humans even when we know intellectually that what we are observing is merely a coincidental arrangement of geological features with no actual sentience or purpose. What is remarkable about the Eye of Sahara is not just that it exists, but that despite its obvious and demonstrable natural origins, despite the well-understood geological explanations for its formation, and despite the scientific documentation of its creation through erosion and uplift, many people continue to regard it with a sense of mystery and wonder that borders on the supernatural, treating it as if it were something inexplicable or deliberately constructed by forces beyond our comprehension. Deep within the volcanic regions of Indonesia, specifically on the island of Java near the Ijen crater, there exists a phenomenon so visually extraordinary that it seems almost impossible to reconcile with our understanding of natural geology. Yet it occurs with reliable consistency throughout the night hours when conditions align perfectly. What witnesses and volcanologists observe here is a brilliant electric blue flame that dances across the volcanic landscape, appearing as though someone has set pure liquid sapphire on fire, creating rivers of cobalt luminescence that flow down the mountainside in defiance of conventional expectations about what lava should look like. These flames burn with an intensity that can reach temperatures exceeding 1,300 degrees Celsius, yet produce this ethereal blue coloration that seems to belong more to the realm of fantasy than to the harsh, molten reality of active volcanism. The mechanism behind this captivating display involves sulfuric gases, particularly sulfur dioxide, which are continuously released from the volcanic vents deep within the Earth, where the intense heat and pressure create a perfect environment for their formation and escape. When these gases emerge from fissures in the volcanic rock and make contact with the oxygen in the atmosphere. They undergo spontaneous combustion at the moment of interaction, and this chemical reaction between sulfur compounds and atmospheric oxygen produces the remarkable blue flames that seem to defy the orange and red appearance we have come to associate with fire and molten earth. The blue coloration itself results from the specific wavelengths of light emitted when sulfur burns in this particular manner, creating a visual phenomenon that persists night after night, decade after decade, largely unnoticed by the wider world despite its extraordinary nature. What remains genuinely remarkable is how such an alien and seemingly impossible occurrence continues to happen in this one specific location, with visitors and researchers regularly documenting the phenomenon, yet it fails to capture the widespread wonder one might expect given its surreal and almost dreamlike appearance, suggesting that even the most extraordinary manifestations of our planet's geological processes can become normalized once they are documented, explained, and categorized within the framework of our scientific understanding. Yet for those who witness the blue flames in person, standing at the crater's edge in the pre-dawn darkness while sulphurous smoke curls around their feet, the sense of wonder remains undimmed, a reminder that understanding a phenomenon scientifically need not diminish its capacity to inspire awe, and that the natural world continues to perform miracles regardless of whether we have cataloged their mechanisms. Imagine standing at a safe distance from an active volcanic eruption, watching the sky above the ash column suddenly illuminate with brilliant bolts of electricity that crack and branch across the darkness like nothing you've ever witnessed before. And this phenomenon is not some trick of light or camera artifact, but rather one of the most violent and electrically charged events that occur naturally on our planet. Volcanic lightning represents a collision between two of Earth's most powerful geological forces, where the ascending column of ash, rock, and gases from a volcano becomes so electrically charged that it generates lightning that can rival or even exceed the intensity of ordinary thunderstorms, and these lightning bolts have been documented illuminating entire ash clouds from within, creating an eerie internal glow that observers describe as both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The mechanism behind this extraordinary phenomenon involves the intense friction and collision of countless ash particles within the volcanic plume, where billions upon billions of tiny fragments of rock and tephra are violently accelerated upward at tremendous speeds. And as these particles collide with one another, and with ice crystals forming in the upper atmosphere, electrons are stripped away through a process similar to static electricity, accumulating in distinct regions of the ash column until the electrical potential becomes so great that it overcomes the insulating properties of the air itself. The lightning that results from this buildup is particularly intense because the ash cloud provides an enormous mass of conductive material suspended in the air, creating conditions where electrical discharge can occur across much greater distances and with significantly higher voltages than what we see in ordinary thunderstorms, and volcanologists have captured spectacular footage of multiple lightning bolts simultaneously illuminating the same ash column, suggesting that the entire interior of these massive plumes becomes a roiling, churning electrical generator. What remains remarkable about volcanic lightning is that despite our scientific understanding of its mechanism, these events continue to occur in places where we rarely observe them directly, happening hundreds or thousands of times across active volcanoes worldwide without mainstream awareness. And we have largely accepted this phenomenon as simply another consequence of volcanic activity rather than marveling at how absurd it truly is that mountains can actively generate their own electrical storms as they tear themselves apart, reminding us that our planet contains forces and processes so extreme and energetic that they create conditions which, in essence, invent lightning on demand as a mere byproduct of geological violence. Ball lightning represents one of the most perplexing and elusive natural phenomena that has captivated human observation for centuries, manifesting as a luminous sphere that appears during thunderstorms and moves with a peculiar intelligence that defies conventional understanding of electromagnetic physics. Witnesses describe encountering these glowing orbs ranging from the size of a human fist to several meters in diameter, hovering silently through the air or drifting along the ground with an almost purposeful trajectory, sometimes entering buildings through walls or windows without leaving any visible damage before vanishing abruptly in a flash of light or with a gentle popping sound. The sphere exhibits an ethereal quality, glowing with colors that shift between white, yellow, orange, red, and blue, often pulsing or dimming in ways that suggest some kind of energy fluctuation within its core, and observers report that these objects generate heat intense enough to be felt from several meters away, yet somehow leave no burn marks on surrounding objects. The mechanism behind ball lightning remains scientifically contested and elusive, with researchers proposing various theoretical explanations including plasma instability, fractal ionization, nuclear reactions, and exotic electromagnetic patterns that somehow become self-sustaining in the atmosphere during specific electrical storm conditions. Some theories suggest that the phenomenon involves a ball of ionized gas held together by rotating magnetic fields, while others propose that silicon from soil vaporized by a lightning strike might recombine in the upper atmosphere to form exotic compounds that luminesce under extreme conditions. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the observed behaviors and properties reported by credible witnesses, including pilots, meteorologists, and military personnel. What remains most remarkable about ball lightning is that despite being reported consistently across centuries, and across virtually every culture and geographic region on Earth, it has proven nearly impossible to reproduce in laboratory settings or predict with any reliability, meaning that science continues to acknowledge its existence while remaining fundamentally unable to explain the underlying mechanisms that govern its formation and behavior. The phenomenon persists in our understanding as a kind of scientific paradox, neither fully accepted as completely understood nor dismissed as mere folklore, representing a humbling reminder that nature contains mysteries which reveal themselves occasionally to observers but stubbornly resist the systematic investigation and replication that characterizes modern scientific methodology, suggesting that somewhere in the interaction between electricity, atmosphere, and electromagnetic fields lies a process so unusual and specific that it remains functionally invisible to conventional research practices. High above the Earth, suspended in the mesosphere where the atmosphere becomes impossibly thin and the air is colder than Antarctica, there exists a phenomenon so fleeting and so difficult to observe that, for decades, scientists weren't entirely sure they were real at all. Yet pilots and astronauts have witnessed these ghostly red bursts dancing across the night sky with such consistency that they can no longer be dismissed as imagination or optical illusions. Red sprites are enormous electrical discharges that occur above thunderstorms, reaching upward from the cloud tops toward the edge of space itself, sometimes extending 50 miles into the upper atmosphere in the span of just a few milliseconds, creating a branching network of luminous red tendrils that looks like a luminescent jellyfish or a tree of pure electricity frozen in the darkness above. The mechanism behind their creation is rooted in the intense electrical activity generated by severe thunderstorms below, where massive charge separations occur between cloud layers and the ground, and when the electric field becomes strong enough, it doesn't just discharge downward in the form of lightning as we typically understand it, but instead creates these upward propagating waves of ionization that excite nitrogen molecules in the thin upper atmosphere to a state of glowing red luminescence. What makes red sprites particularly remarkable is that they occur in near silence, radiating energy across vast distances with hardly a sound reaching observers on the ground, existing in a realm so isolated from human experience that for most of our existence we had no awareness they were happening at all. Yet now we understand they are occurring constantly above thunderstorms throughout the world, particularly over equatorial and tropical regions where convective activity reaches its most extreme. The fact that these phenomena persisted unobserved and largely undocumented for the entirety of human history, only to be confirmed in the 1980s through low-light television cameras aboard aircraft, speaks to how much of Earth's natural drama occurs in realms we simply cannot see with our naked eyes, and despite our modern technology and constant monitoring of the skies. We have normalized their existence as just another atmospheric curiosity, rather than recognizing them as a testament to the truly alien electrical environments that hover just above our heads, where the Earth meets the vacuum of space. Yet perhaps this blindness is fitting, for red sprites represent a humbling reminder that our planet operates on scales both temporal and spatial that dwarf human perception. They flash and vanish in milliseconds across regions larger than entire countries, a silent celestial ballet occurring nightly above storms we cannot even see from the ground, indifferent to our awareness or ignorance of their existence. Imagine standing beneath a perfectly clear sky on a bright, sunny afternoon, when suddenly you witness what appears to be a massive arc of fire stretching horizontally across the heavens, a phenomenon that seems to defy every natural law you understand about light and weather. This is the fire rainbow, one of the most visually spectacular optical illusions that occurs in our atmosphere, and it happens far more frequently than most people realize, yet remains largely unnoticed by those who fail to look upward at precisely the right moment. Fire rainbows are created when sunlight enters ice crystals that are suspended in cirrostratus clouds at an altitude typically between 20,000 and 40,000 feet above the Earth's surface. And these clouds must be positioned at a specific angle relative to the observer's position and the sun's location in the sky. The ice crystals within these thin, wispy clouds act as miniature prisms, refracting and dispersing the sun's white light into its constituent colors, much like traditional rainbows do, but the orientation of the hexagonal ice crystals creates a horizontal band of color rather than the familiar arc that follows rain. The phenomenon requires the sun to be positioned at least 58 degrees above the horizon, which means fire rainbows can only occur during specific times of day depending on your latitude and the season, and the sun must strike the ice crystals at a precise angle that allows the light to bend through the crystal and exit at exactly 22 degrees from the entry point. What makes fire rainbows so extraordinary is that unlike regular rainbows, which appear as arcs opposite the sun, fire rainbows create what meteorologists call a circumhorizontal arc, a vivid, elongated smile of color that seems to hover independently in the sky without any obvious atmospheric disturbance. The colors typically appear in the sequence of red on the outer edge, followed by orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet on the inner edge, displaying the entire visible spectrum in its proper order. Yet the illusion is so striking that observers often struggle to believe they are witnessing a natural phenomenon at all. Despite the fact that fire rainbows are produced through the fundamental laws of optical physics, the same principles that have governed light's behavior for billions of years, they remain mysterious to most people because the specific conditions required for their manifestation are relatively uncommon in populated areas, and many individuals simply never develop the habit of observing the sky with sufficient attention to notice them. On the surface of frozen lakes, coastal ice, and salt marshes during the coldest parts of winter, delicate crystalline formations emerge that look almost like flowers blooming across a bed of ice, and these structures are called frost flowers, though they are not flowers at all, but rather one of nature's most intricate and seemingly impossible creations. When saltwater or slightly saline water freezes beneath the surface, while the air temperature drops significantly below the freezing point, the ice itself begins to reject the salt that cannot be incorporated into its crystalline lattice, and this rejected salt accumulates at the surface in a brine layer that remains liquid even at sub-zero temperatures due to its high salt concentration. As the temperature continues to plummet and wind moves across this liquid brine layer, the moisture begins to evaporate and crystallize simultaneously, forming these delicate, feather-like structures that can grow several centimeters tall, creating what appears to be an impossible garden of ice formations that seem too fragile and too organized to exist in nature. The mechanism driving their formation relies on the principle of frost deposition, where water vapor in the air transitions directly into solid ice without passing through a liquid phase. But in this case, the process occurs in an extraordinarily precise way that produces these intricate geometric patterns, as the crystallization follows the pathways of salt concentration and temperature gradients. What makes frost flowers so remarkable is that they represent a perfect intersection of multiple physical forces operating simultaneously. The rejection of salt during freezing, the continuous evaporation of brine in extreme cold, the directional pressure of wind, and the precise temperature differential between the ice surface and the surrounding air, all working together in such a way that creates these botanical-looking structures that seem to defy the harsh, sterile nature of a frozen landscape. Yet despite their ethereal appearance and the complexity required for their formation, frost flowers are commonplace in polar regions and emerge with remarkable consistency whenever the environmental conditions align properly, suggesting that what seems miraculous and improbable at first glance is actually a predictable and inevitable consequence of the laws of thermodynamics and crystallography operating in their domain. And we have come to simply accept these delicate ice sculptures as merely another winter phenomenon, another quiet manifestation of nature's capacity to generate beauty and complexity from the interaction of cold, salt, wind, and moisture. High in the mountains of the Andes, particularly in regions like Peru, Chile, and Argentina, where glaciers persist at elevations above 13,000 feet, there exists a phenomenon so visually striking and scientifically fascinating that it seems more like the creation of some otherworldly landscape artist than a product of ordinary planetary physics. These formations are called penitents, named by Spanish conquistadors who thought they resembled rows of kneeling monks in prayer, and they are essentially elongated spikes of hardened snow and ice that can stretch anywhere from a few inches to over 15 feet into the air, arranged in perfectly organized rows that stretch across entire mountainsides like an army of frozen sentinels standing in eternal supplication. The surfaces between these spikes become progressively lower and darker, creating a maze of shadows and crevasses that would be treacherous to traverse on foot. Yet these formations appear with remarkable consistency in high-altitude tropical regions where specific atmospheric conditions align in peculiar ways. The mechanism behind their creation involves a process called differential sublimation, where the intense ultraviolet radiation from the sun at high altitude causes the snow and ice to transform directly from solid to vapor without passing through a liquid state. But this sublimation does not occur uniformly across the snowfield. Instead, slight variations in surface texture, imperceptible wind patterns, and minute differences in solar exposure create microscopic depressions in the snow, and these initial imperfections become the seeds of amplification, with sublimation preferentially occurring on the raised areas between the depressions, while the shadowed valleys between the spikes sublimate far more slowly, causing the initial minor irregularities to grow deeper and more pronounced over weeks and months, transforming a nearly flat snowfield into a forest of jagged ice towers that can change the entire character of a mountainside. What makes this phenomenon particularly mesmerizing to contemplate is how these structures emerge and persist despite the fact that they actually make the landscape more hostile and more difficult to navigate. Yet the underlying physics that creates them is so indifferent to human convenience that the formations simply continue to develop wherever the precise combination of high altitude, intense solar radiation, relatively low humidity, and suitable snow conditions allows, suggesting that nature operates according to its own inexorable logic regardless of whether the results are beautiful, useful, or obstructive to those of us who occasionally find ourselves wandering through them. Across vast desert landscapes in places like Nevada, California, China, and the Arabian Peninsula, there exist formations of sand dunes that produce haunting, otherworldly sounds seemingly of their own accord, a phenomenon that has bewildered travelers and scientists alike for centuries, creating auditory experiences that range from deep booming rumbles to high-pitched whistles that can reach volumes of up to 115 decibels, comparable to the roar of a jet engine. When massive quantities of sand shift and avalanche down the slopes of these dunes, particularly during specific weather conditions or when triggered by footsteps or vibrations, the grains of sand move in unison with such synchronized precision that they generate acoustic frequencies that resonate through the air, producing sounds that early explorers and local inhabitants attributed to supernatural forces, spirits, or divine intervention, never suspecting that the explanation lay within the physics of granular materials themselves. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves the unique properties of the sand grains found in these specific dunes, which are typically of uniform size and shape, allowing them to vibrate at harmonic frequencies when they shift collectively, and the moisture content within the dune, combined with the density of the sand pack and the particular mineral composition, creates ideal conditions for acoustic resonance, where millions of grains moving in synchronization generate vibrations that propagate through the dune's structure like waves through a massive instrument. Despite our modern understanding of the science behind singing dunes, these formations continue to produce their eerie melodies year after year, persisting in their mysterious performances as if unaware that humanity has decoded their secret, and travelers still visit these remote locations to witness and hear these acoustic wonders for themselves, to experience the strange sensation of sound emerging from something as seemingly inert and lifeless as sand, reminding us that even in our thoroughly explored and scientifically explained world, nature retains pockets of genuine wonder that feel almost supernatural in their manifestation, even when we fully comprehend the rational mechanisms at work. The most famous of these dunes, such as the booming dunes of the Mojave Desert and the singing sands of the Gobi Desert, have become pilgrimage sites for acoustic enthusiasts and curious wanderers who trek across inhospitable terrain hoping to hear what ancient peoples described in mythology and legend, finding in these experiences a profound connection between the physical world and the realm of human imagination. Beneath the surface of certain lakes in the coldest regions of Earth, particularly in places like Canada, Siberia, and Alaska, there exists a phenomenon so visually striking that it seems almost impossible that it could occur naturally without human intervention or digital manipulation. These are frozen methane bubbles, and they represent one of the most hypnotic and otherworldly manifestations of geology and microbiology working in concert beneath sheets of ice so thick that sunlight cannot penetrate them. When you stand on the frozen surface of lakes like Abraham Lake in Alberta or other glacial bodies of water in extreme northern latitudes, you can observe what appear to be perfect spheres or hemispheres of trapped gas suspended in the crystalline ice itself, creating the illusion of 1,000 transparent marbles pressed into the frozen water from below. The mechanism behind their formation is rooted in the decomposition of organic matter at the lake bottom, where bacteria break down ancient plant material and sediment in the complete absence of oxygen, a process called anaerobic decomposition that produces methane gas as a byproduct. This methane rises through the water column in bubbles and becomes trapped when the water freezes from the top downward during winter months, essentially capturing these pockets of gas at the moment when the water transitions from liquid to solid state. The bubbles remain preserved within the ice layer, sometimes in such abundance that the frozen surface appears almost pockmarked or studded with these captured pockets of flammable gas, creating an aesthetic that feels more aligned with science fiction imagery than with geological reality. What makes this phenomenon particularly compelling is that despite understanding exactly why it happens and accepting it as a genuine natural process, there remains something deeply unsettling about witnessing it in person, a sensation that persists even after the mechanism has been fully explained and rationalized. We have come to accept these frozen methane bubbles as simply another quirk of extreme polar environments, another Instagram-worthy feature of the Arctic landscape. Yet the fundamental strangeness of seeing thousands of perfect spheres of combustible gas suspended in ice, all originating from the decomposition of prehistoric organisms, never quite loses its capacity to provoke a sense of wonder and mild unease that defies the logical explanations we have constructed around it. Perhaps this persistent unease stems from the reminder that even in the most frozen and seemingly static environments on Earth, there is constant activity occurring beneath the surface, invisible microbial processes converting the remains of ancient life into gas that seeks escape, a cycle of transformation that continues indifferently whether or not we are present to witness its crystallized evidence. Scattered across various continents, there exist bodies of water that defy our expectations of what lakes should look like, displaying a vivid pink or salmon coloration so striking that they seem almost digitally altered or artificially dyed. Yet these remarkable pink lakes are entirely natural phenomena born from specific combinations of geological and biological conditions that have persisted for thousands of years. Lake Urmia in Iran, Lake Laguna Sejar in Chile, Hutt Lagoon in Australia, and the famous lakes of Senegal, including Lake Retba, represent some of the most famous examples of these peculiar waterways, and their pink hue originates not from some mysterious or exotic mineral, but rather from the presence of incredibly high salt concentrations combined with the proliferation of specific microorganisms and algae species that thrive in hypersaline environments where few other organisms can survive. The primary architect of this coloration is often the carotenoid pigments produced by halophilic bacteria and algae such as Dunaliella salina, which generate these pigments as a natural adaptation to protect themselves from the intense ultraviolet radiation that penetrates the shallow, crystalline waters, and simultaneously, the extraordinary salinity levels, sometimes reaching concentrations several times higher than ocean water, create an environment so hostile to conventional life that only these specialized organisms possess the biochemical machinery necessary to endure such extreme conditions. What makes these pink lakes even more remarkable is that their existence represents a delicate equilibrium that has somehow managed to persist despite modern environmental pressures, industrial development, and climate fluctuations that threaten to disrupt their precise ecological balance. Yet communities have learned to coexist with and even benefit from these unusual waterways, using them for salt harvesting, mineral extraction. And increasingly as tourist destinations that draw visitors, specifically because of their otherworldly appearance. The fact that we have come to accept these pink lakes as natural wonders rather than warning signs of environmental catastrophe speaks to how our perception of what constitutes a normal landscape can shift and adapt, and how even extreme biological conditions that seem almost hostile can generate their own strange beauty and become integrated into the cultural and economic fabric of the regions where they naturally occur. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson these pink lakes teach us is that nature's extremes often harbor unexpected resilience and beauty, reminding us that life finds ways to flourish in conditions we once deemed utterly inhospitable, and that our role as stewards of the natural world involves not just preservation of the familiar, but also protection of these rare and fragile ecosystems that challenge our understanding of what sustains life itself. Nestled in British Columbia, Canada, near the small town of Osgoode, there exists a body of water so visually extraordinary that it seems almost impossible that nature could have created something so utterly alien without human intervention. Yet this place is entirely real and has existed for thousands of years in a state of perpetual transformation. Spotted Lake, known locally as Kliluk, covers approximately 75 acres and presents itself as a landscape of hundreds upon hundreds of perfectly formed circles, each one a distinct pool of water separated from its neighbors by raised mineral deposits that create natural barriers and walls. During the summer months, as the intense heat of the interior plateau beats down relentlessly and the water begins to evaporate, the mineral composition becomes increasingly concentrated, and the lake undergoes a dramatic metamorphosis that reveals its true nature as a geological wonder, with each circular pool turning a different color depending on its unique mineral content and chemical composition. Some circles glow a striking emerald green, others shift to brilliant turquoise blues, while still more display deep burgundies, oranges, and yellows, creating a kaleidoscopic pattern that looks far more like an alien landscape or the product of an elaborate artistic installation than any natural phenomenon one might expect to encounter on Earth. The mechanism behind this extraordinary display involves the specific balance of minerals dissolved within the water, including magnesium sulfate, calcium sulfate, and sodium sulfate, which concentrate at different rates and in different proportions as evaporation occurs, and these mineral variations directly influence the light absorption and reflection properties of the water itself, thereby creating the distinctive coloration that makes each pool visually unique. What makes Spotted Lake even more remarkable is that this process reverses itself entirely as seasons change and rainfall returns, with the circles gradually filling with water again and the mineral concentrations diluting back to more uniform levels, transforming the landscape back into something closer to a conventional lake before the next summer cycle begins the transformation anew. Despite the overwhelming visual evidence of Spotted Lake's reality and its documentation across countless photographs, scientific studies, and tourist visits, there remains something almost dreamlike about it, a quality that persists even when one stands directly before it and witnesses the impossible colors with their own eyes. Because the sheer improbability of nature producing something so perfectly geometric and so vividly pigmented without any obvious external manipulation creates a cognitive dissonance that makes our minds struggle to fully accept what we are observing as genuine. Deep beneath the surface of the ocean, in the darkest regions where sunlight cannot penetrate and pressure would crush most living things, there exist bodies of water so dense and saline that they form distinct layers of liquid that do not mix with the surrounding seawater, creating what scientists call underwater brine pools. These are not mythological places or theoretical constructs, but actual geographical features that exist on the ocean floor, most notably discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea. When you descend to these depths and encounter a brine pool, what you are witnessing is essentially a pocket of extremely concentrated saltwater that has accumulated in natural depressions on the seafloor, creating boundaries so stark that they resemble the shorelines of underwater lakes, complete with waves and currents that exist independent of the surrounding ocean. The water within these pools can be anywhere from 3 to 8 times saltier than normal seawater, making them so dense that they sink to the lowest points and remain separated from the less dense ocean water above them by a clearly defined interface that looks almost like a physical barrier. The mechanism behind the formation of these pools involves the dissolution of salt deposits in the earth, combined with the accumulation of brine-rich fluids that emerge from geological formations beneath the seafloor. And the extreme density of this brine prevents it from naturally mixing or dispersing into the surrounding water. Marine life near these pools exists in a state of perpetual adaptation to an environment that seems to violate the basic assumptions we hold about how water behaves, because creatures that venture into these brine pools immediately lose consciousness and eventually die. Yet despite this lethal nature, life continues to exist around the margins of these pools, where organisms have evolved to thrive in the transition zones. What makes underwater brine pools particularly striking in their persistence is that they continue to exist and accumulate despite having no apparent reason to remain stable or permanent, defying our intuition about how fluids should behave in a fluid medium. And yet we have gradually normalized this strange phenomenon simply by studying it, cataloging it, and incorporating it into our understanding of deep ocean geology. The existence of these underwater lakes within the ocean represents one of the final frontiers of human discovery, places so remote and hostile that they remain largely unexplored, and the fact that they exist in substantial numbers across multiple ocean basins suggests that our planet contains far more complexity and strangeness in its deepest places than we have yet accounted for. Deep within the Earth's crust, beneath layers of rock and sediment that have accumulated over billions of years, exists a place so extraordinarily hot that it defies easy comprehension, a location that has fascinated geologists and planetary scientists for decades as they attempt to understand the fundamental nature of our planet's interior. This place is the core of the Earth itself, specifically the inner core, where temperatures reach approximately 9,000 to 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is remarkably close to the surface temperature of the Sun, despite being trapped in complete darkness miles beneath our feet, where no human being has ever traveled, and where the pressure from all the rock above would crush anything instantly. The explanation for this extreme heat lies in the planet's formation roughly 4.5 billion years ago, when gravitational collapse during the accretion process generated tremendous internal heat, and subsequently, radioactive elements like uranium, thorium, and potassium continued to decay within the Earth's interior, releasing thermal energy that slowly radiates outward through the mantle and crust, creating convection currents that drive plate tectonics and volcanic activity across the surface. Yet despite the logical understanding that our planet contains this furnace at its center, we continue to live our lives above it with barely a thought, rarely pausing to contemplate that we are standing on a thin shell of rock floating above an environment more extreme than anything we could artificially create. And we have normalized this reality so thoroughly that it remains abstract and distant in our collective consciousness, mentioned only in passing during geography lessons before being forgotten entirely. Even though this molten inferno beneath us is fundamentally responsible for every earthquake that devastates cities, every volcano that erupts and reshapes landscapes, and every hot spring that provides comfort to those who discover it, making it simultaneously one of the most powerful and one of the most ignored forces in human existence. Perhaps most remarkably, this hidden heat that we ignore so completely is the very engine that will eventually reclaim the surface of our planet, ensuring that even the most permanent-seeming structures we build will one day be melted back into the molten depths from which all terrestrial matter originally emerged, a humbling reminder of our temporary tenure on this dynamic and ever-changing world. In this sense, the inner core represents not merely a geological feature, but a memento mori for humanity itself, a constant, invisible reminder that all our accomplishments, from the grandest monuments to the most intimate moments, unfold upon a foundation fundamentally beyond our control, subject to forces operating on timescales that render our civilizations little more than brief flickers in the Earth's long history. Deep within the interior of the Antarctic continent, in a region so remote that it remains one of the most difficult places on Earth to reach and study, there exists a plateau of ice and rock where temperatures plummet to levels that seem almost incomprehensible to the human mind, where the thermometer has recorded readings as low as -128.6 degrees Fahrenheit, making it the coldest naturally occurring temperature ever measured on the surface of our planet. A distinction held by the Plateau Station and the surrounding East Antarctic Plateau, where the air becomes so cold that carbon dioxide begins to freeze solid from the atmosphere itself, forming delicate crystals that catch and scatter what little sunlight manages to penetrate during the brief Antarctic summer months. The mechanism behind this extreme cold is rooted in the fundamental physics of our planet's climate system, as this particular region sits at the highest elevation of the Antarctic ice sheet, at approximately 3,850 meters above sea level, where the thin atmosphere above provides almost no insulation between the surface and the void of space, combined with the relentless loss of heat radiating upward from the ice beneath. While the surrounding landscape reflects nearly all incoming solar radiation back into the atmosphere like a giant mirror of white, and during the Antarctic winter, which lasts for months of complete darkness, there is absolutely no solar energy input whatsoever to compensate for this tremendous heat loss, creating a perfect thermodynamic condition for the development of extreme cold. Yet despite the apparent logical impossibility of human survival in such a place, despite the fact that exposed skin can develop frostbite in minutes, and that breathing becomes a painful exercise as the air crystallizes in the lungs and nasal passages, we have continued to establish and maintain research stations across Antarctica, including in the interior plateau itself, where scientists voluntarily spend months in these conditions. Normalizing the presence of human beings in an environment that seems fundamentally incompatible with human life, perpetuating research missions that push the boundaries of what we consider habitable, and continuing to return year after year to study climate patterns, ice cores, and atmospheric phenomena, accepting these extreme conditions as simply part of the price of scientific knowledge, transforming the coldest place on Earth into a workplace, however temporary and however uncomfortable, where humans continue to venture despite the absolute hostility of the environment itself. Since the 1970s, thousands of people across the globe have reported hearing a persistent low-frequency sound, a deep humming vibration that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, often described as resembling the distant rumble of a diesel engine or the thrumming of electrical power lines. Yet when investigators arrive with sensitive audio equipment to measure and document this phenomenon, their instruments frequently register nothing at all, capturing only the ambient silence of the environment, while the witnesses insist the sound is undeniably real and deeply disturbing. The reports have come from populated cities and remote rural areas alike, from places as geographically diverse as Bristol in England, Taos in New Mexico, coastal regions of Australia, and numerous other locations worldwide, with some sufferers claiming the hum has driven them to the brink of madness through sleepless nights and relentless acoustic torment that no amount of soundproofing or earplugs can adequately diminish. Scientists and researchers have proposed numerous explanations for the phenomenon, suggesting everything from low-frequency industrial machinery and infrastructure vibrations that exist below the threshold of standard audio equipment, to infrasound generated by atmospheric and geological processes, or even the possibility that the human auditory system itself might be resonating at certain frequencies in ways we do not yet fully understand, creating a perception of sound where external sources may not exist or may be far too subtle for conventional measurement devices to register. The human brain is extraordinarily susceptible to pattern recognition and expectation, and once a person becomes convinced they are hearing something, their neural pathways can become so attuned to detecting that signal that even random ambient noise becomes interpreted as confirmation of what they believe to be real, a psychological phenomenon that creates a feedback loop where conviction strengthens perception. What makes the worldwide hum particularly fascinating is that it persists as a legitimate mystery despite decades of investigation, neither fully explained nor definitively debunked, existing in that uncomfortable liminal space between dismissed psychological phenomenon and genuine unexplained sensory experience, which allows it to continue capturing the attention and testimony of new hearers who stumble upon accounts of others and begin listening for the sound themselves, wondering if what they hear in the background hum of modern civilization is something unique and sinister, or simply the audio landscape of a world filled with machines and infrastructure that we have learned to stop consciously noticing. Imagine standing at the edge of an ocean, looking out at the endless expanse of water stretching toward the horizon, and somewhere dissolved within that entire mass of liquid is actual gold, the same precious metal that has driven human civilization to extraordinary lengths, that has funded empires and wars and art and civilization itself, and yet it remains utterly inaccessible to us despite its omnipresence. Every single body of saltwater on Earth contains dissolved gold particles, distributed throughout the water in concentrations that, while individually minute, add up to an almost incomprehensible total amount when multiplied across the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and every sea and gulf and strait in between. Scientists have calculated that there are approximately 20 million tons of gold suspended in the world's oceans, an amount so vast that if it could somehow be extracted and collected and refined, it would dwarf every gold reserve ever accumulated by human civilization throughout all of recorded history. Yet despite this enormous wealth seemingly floating all around us, surrounding entire continents and touching every coastline, humanity has never successfully developed an economically viable method to extract it. And this is where the mechanism of the situation becomes genuinely fascinating, because the gold is present in such dilute concentrations, typically measured in parts per trillion, that the cost of extracting it, processing it, and refining it into usable form far exceeds whatever market value the gold would eventually command once separated from the ocean. Methods have been theoretically proposed and experimentally attempted, from using ion exchange resins to chemical precipitation to biological extraction. Yet none of these approaches have overcome the fundamental economic reality that the energy and resources required to pull gold from seawater costs more money than the gold itself is worth, creating a paradoxical situation where immense wealth literally surrounds us while remaining perpetually beyond our grasp. This reality persists because we have quietly accepted the distinction between theoretical value and practical value, between something that exists and something that is actually obtainable or useful. A cognitive framework that allows us to acknowledge the gold is there while simultaneously accepting that it might as well not be. And so the ocean continues to hold this vast hidden treasure that will likely never be claimed. A reminder that abundance and scarcity are not absolute measurements, but are instead defined entirely by our ability to access and utilize resources, transforming the sea into a monument to the difference between possession and proximity. The same principle applies to countless other resources hidden in plain sight: uranium in seawater, rare earth elements in deep ocean vents, phosphorus in agricultural runoff, each representing a frontier of scarcity that economics, not geology, has rendered unreachable. Beneath your feet, miles down in the absolute darkness of our planet, something extraordinary is happening at this very moment. Deep within the Earth, at a depth of approximately 1,300 miles, exists the inner core, a solid sphere of iron and nickel that is spinning at its own independent rate, rotating separately from the rest of the planet's surface and mantle. This core is not simply tumbling along with the Earth's general rotation, but rather it has its own angular velocity, its own rhythm of turning that operates on a different timescale than the crust beneath your house or the ground where you stand right now. Scientists have determined through sophisticated seismic wave analysis and magnetic field measurements that this inner core completes additional rotations beyond what the planet's surface does, meaning it laps the rest of the Earth in terms of spinning, gaining on us in a way that seems almost impossible given that it is locked inside a solid planet with no obvious mechanism to cause independent movement. The reason this happens relates to the complex interactions between the liquid outer core and the solid inner core, separated by different densities, temperatures, and magnetic forces that push and pull at the iron-nickel sphere in ways we are still working to fully understand. The convection currents in the liquid outer core, driven by heat from the Earth's radioactive decay, create electromagnetic interactions that influence the inner core's rotation. Additionally, the gravitational interactions and the shear forces exerted by the mantle above create torques that are not uniformly distributed, allowing the inner core to experience a net rotational force that differs from what affects the surface. The Earth's magnetic field, which is generated largely by the movement of liquid iron in the outer core, may also play a role in constraining or accelerating the inner core's spin, creating a dynamic system where nothing is truly static or synchronized. What makes this phenomenon particularly striking is how we have integrated this knowledge into our understanding of geology without it fundamentally altering our perception of the Earth as a stable, predictable place where everything moves together as one unified object. We know that the core spins faster or slower than we do, that there is this hidden world of asymmetry occurring where we imagine there is only solid uniformity, and yet we continue to build our cities and live our lives without any accommodation for this reality. The inner core advances on us by several degrees per year, and in millions of years, it will have completed rotations relative to the surface that will dwarf all the rotations we experience in real time. And we simply accept this as one more fascinating detail about our planet, rather than treating it as the impossible marvel that it truly is. Deep within the White Mountains of eastern California, hidden among the twisted and gnarled bristlecone pines that cling to the rocky slopes at nearly 11,000 feet above sea level, there exists a single organism that has been alive for more than 5,000 years, making it older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than written language itself, older than any human being who has ever walked this earth, and this ancient being is a tree called Methuselah. A Great Basin bristlecone pine that continues to grow and breathe and produce new needles with each passing season, despite its incomprehensibly advanced age. The exact location of Methuselah is kept secret by the United States Forest Service and the scientists who study it, because for many years the tree's location was publicly known, and visitors would carve their initials into its bark and remove pieces of it as souvenirs, until one person actually cut the tree down in 1964, which is perhaps the most staggering act of environmental vandalism in modern history, and though that particular tree was not Methuselah itself. The incident prompted authorities to conceal the location of the most ancient bristlecone pines to protect them from human interference and destruction. The reason Methuselah has survived for so long in such a harsh and unforgiving environment is rooted in the specific biology of bristlecone pines, which possess an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize damage and continue functioning even when large portions of their trunk and root systems are dead, allowing the tree to survive severe droughts, extreme cold, lightning strikes, and animal damage by essentially walling off the damaged sections and continuing to live through the remaining healthy tissue. What makes this tree so psychologically captivating is the profound temporal disconnect it creates in our minds, because 5,000 years is simply too vast a time frame for the human brain to genuinely comprehend. And when we attempt to imagine what was happening when Methuselah was already thousands of years old, the entire scope of human civilization from ancient Egypt through the rise and fall of empires and the birth of modern technology appears almost instantaneous by comparison. And this stark confrontation with deep time and the insignificance of human timescales relative to the natural world produces a strange existential vertigo that feels both humbling and dreamlike. We continue to be fascinated by Methuselah despite the fact that its existence challenges nearly every assumption we make about how long things should last, and we have normalized the idea of protecting it by keeping its location secret, which itself is remarkable because it represents a collective agreement that some things should be preserved not for human access or benefit, but simply for the fact of their existence and their incomparable age and their silent testimony to the passage of epochs. Deep beneath the forest floor of Oregon, spanning across nearly 6,000 acres of land, exists a single living organism so vast that it defies our ordinary comprehension of what life should look like. And this organism is a honey fungus known by the scientific name Armillaria austi, which has been growing and spreading through the soil for thousands of years, possibly as long as 2,400 years, making it not only the largest organism on Earth, but potentially one of the oldest as well. And yet most people walking through the forest above it have absolutely no idea that they are treading upon what is essentially a single unified creature. The organism consists of a massive network of thread-like filaments called mycelium that weave through the soil like an invisible neural network, connecting and communicating across miles of underground space. And these filaments are all genetically identical, all part of the same individual, all extensions of a single entity that weighs somewhere in the region of 600 tons, roughly equivalent to the weight of 100 elephants or several large whales combined. What makes this particularly remarkable is that the fungus achieves this enormous size and longevity not through any extraordinary biological innovation, but rather through the simple, patient process of spreading mycelium through decaying wood and soil, absorbing nutrients through chemical processes that occur continuously and relentlessly, breaking down dead matter and converting it into fuel for its own expansion. The organism reproduces sexually only occasionally, and the fruiting bodies that we recognize as mushrooms are merely the visible reproductive structures, temporary and relatively insignificant compared to the vast underground network that constitutes the true organism. And most of the time, the entire massive creature exists in complete invisibility, working beneath our feet without fanfare or recognition. What is perhaps most psychologically unsettling about this reality is that we have developed an entire system of thinking about life that fundamentally excludes or minimizes the significance of such organisms, classifying fungi as somehow less real or less important than animals or even plants, despite the fact that this single fungus covers more area than most national parks and contains more biomass than creatures we consider magnificent and worthy of study and protection. We normalize our inability to see or directly interact with the fungus by simply not thinking about it at all, and we persist in viewing the forest floor as empty space rather than as the living body of an incomprehensibly large individual creature, allowing our perception of scale and individuality to remain bounded by the limits of our own sensory experience. Deep beneath the ocean's surface, in the twilight zones where sunlight barely penetrates and darkness dominates, there exists a creature so profoundly skilled at the art of invisibility that it seems to defy the very laws of perception itself. And this creature is the cuttlefish, an eight-armed cephalopod that possesses one of the most extraordinary biological mechanisms for concealment ever to evolve on planet Earth. What makes the cuttlefish's camouflage so genuinely insane is not merely that it can change color, but rather that it accomplishes this feat through a system so complex, so multi-layered, and so perfectly coordinated that it essentially operates like a living optical illusion machine, capable of transforming its entire body in mere milliseconds to match virtually any background, texture, or pattern in its immediate environment. The cuttlefish does this through three distinct types of specialized skin cells called chromatophores, iridophores, and leucophores, which work in seamless harmony to produce an almost supernatural level of color-matching precision that extends far beyond simple pigment changes into the realm of texture alteration and reflective manipulation. What truly defies logic is that cuttlefish are actually colorblind, completely unable to perceive color through their eyes in any meaningful way. Yet despite this seemingly catastrophic biological limitation, they can match their surroundings with such devastating accuracy that predators and prey alike become virtually incapable of distinguishing them from rocks, sand, seaweed, or coral formations. The mechanism by which they accomplish this feat remains partly mysterious even to modern marine biologists, though current research suggests that cuttlefish may possess light-sensitive proteins distributed throughout their skin that operate independently of their eyes, allowing them to somehow perceive and respond to color and light patterns directly through their dermal tissue in ways that completely circumvent their visual cortex and conventional sensory pathways. This creature can alter not only its pigmentation, but also the actual texture of its skin, raising and lowering thousands of tiny papillae in three-dimensional patterns that create shadows, highlights, and physical topographies that perfectly mirror their chosen environment, creating an effect so convincing that a cuttlefish pressed against a rocky seabed becomes virtually indistinguishable from the rock itself. Despite possessing this nearly magical ability to render itself invisible, cuttlefish continue to exist in a world where predators still hunt them, where they must still forage and compete for resources, and where their camouflage abilities, however remarkable, still fail them sometimes, demonstrating that even the most perfectly evolved biological systems operate within limitations that evolution itself cannot overcome. Imagine filling two identical containers with water, one with hot water and one with cold water, then placing both in a freezer at the same temperature, and discovering that the hot water actually freezes first, defying everything your intuition tells you about thermodynamics and the transfer of heat. This phenomenon is known as the Mpemba Effect, named after Erasto Mpemba, a Tanzanian student who observed this counterintuitive behavior in the 1960s, though the effect itself had been documented centuries earlier by Aristotle and other natural philosophers who were equally perplexed by its occurrence. The hot water, which logically should take longer to cool down before it can begin the freezing process, somehow manages to transform into solid ice before the cold water that started with a significant thermal disadvantage, creating a paradox that challenges our fundamental understanding of how temperature and phase transitions work in physical systems. The mechanism behind this effect remains genuinely mysterious, with scientists proposing numerous explanations that each contain kernels of truth, but none completely solving the puzzle in its entirety. One theory suggests that hot water has less dissolved gas than cold water, since gases are less soluble at higher temperatures, and this reduced gas content means there is less resistance to the freezing process and less insulation preventing heat from escaping. Another explanation proposes that the expansion and contraction of water as it cools creates convection patterns that are more efficient at removing heat from hot water containers compared to cold water containers, allowing the thermal energy to dissipate more rapidly than we would expect. Still, other researchers point to the properties of hydrogen bonding, suggesting that the molecular structure of water at different temperatures creates different energy states that affect how quickly crystallization can occur when temperatures drop below freezing point. The Mpemba effect persists in scientific literature and educational discussions despite lacking a universally accepted explanation, which is remarkable considering how much we believe we understand about thermodynamics and heat transfer, demonstrating that even in domains we consider thoroughly explored and well-mapped by centuries of scientific progress, anomalies continue to exist that humble our comprehension. The effect only manifests under specific conditions, which is partly why it took so long to be formally recognized and why it remains controversial even today, since many researchers cannot consistently reproduce it in their laboratories, leading some to suspect that experimental variables or measurement techniques play crucial roles in whether the phenomenon appears or vanishes entirely. When lightning strikes sand with temperatures exceeding 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit, something extraordinary happens in those microseconds of contact, transforming ordinary silicon dioxide into something almost otherworldly that persists as a physical reminder of nature's most violent atmospheric phenomena. The intense heat from a lightning bolt causes the sand particles to melt instantaneously, and as the electrical current courses through the ground, it fuses these molten grains together into a glassy, tube-like structure that solidifies within seconds as the lightning dissipates and temperatures plummet back to normal levels, creating what scientists and collectors call fulgurites, natural glass formations that are genuinely real and can be found in sandy beaches, desert regions, and areas prone to frequent lightning strikes around the world. These formations are hollow tubes of glass, sometimes branching like root systems and extending several feet into the earth, with exteriors that appear rough and blackened from the carbon residue, while interiors gleam with a glossy, glass-like surface that catches light in unexpected ways, creating an almost ethereal quality that seems impossible for something created by raw elemental force. The fascination with fulgurites persists because they represent one of the few tangible pieces of evidence we can hold that proves the incomprehensible power of lightning, a phenomenon so brief and violent that it leaves behind this fragile, brittle monument to its existence. And yet most people walk through beaches and deserts every day completely unaware that these extraordinary objects are scattered beneath their feet, waiting to be discovered by those curious enough to search beneath the sand after storms. What makes fulgurites particularly compelling is how they bridge the gap between destruction and creation, between chaos and structure, demonstrating that even in nature's most violent moments, there emerges something beautiful and scientifically valuable, something that transforms the abstract concept of electrical energy into a physical object we can examine, photograph, and study. And somehow this translation of an invisible force into visible matter continues to captivate our imagination in ways that more conventional geological formations simply do not manage to achieve. Collectors prize fulgurites not merely as curiosities, but as scientific artifacts that reveal information about lightning's behavior, electrical conductivity in different soil types, and the extreme geological processes that occur in mere fractions of a second, making each specimen a unique record of a specific atmospheric event that can never be precisely replicated or predicted. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the ancient Romans constructed buildings, aqueducts, and harbor structures using a material called Roman concrete, a mixture primarily composed of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater that possessed a remarkable property that modern engineers are only now beginning to fully understand and appreciate. This concrete did not simply sit inert within the walls of these structures, but rather it engaged in a slow, continuous process of self-repair that allowed it to mend small cracks and fractures as they formed, a phenomenon that kept many Roman buildings standing and functional long after the empire itself had collapsed into history. The mechanism behind this extraordinary durability lies within the chemistry of the volcanic ash, which contains reactive silica compounds that, when exposed to water seeping through microscopic cracks in the concrete, would undergo a chemical reaction that produced new mineral growth within those cracks, essentially filling them from the inside out with crystalline material that was just as strong as the surrounding concrete itself. This self-healing process was not instantaneous or dramatic, but rather a gradual, patient transformation that occurred over months and years, continuously strengthening the structure and preventing the progressive failure that would normally occur in conventional building materials as stress accumulated in weakened areas. Modern concrete, by contrast, relies on Portland cement and does not possess these healing properties, which means that once cracks form in contemporary structures, they tend to expand and worsen over time unless they are manually repaired by workers, a process that is expensive, labor-intensive, and never quite as effective as the material healing itself. Scientists and engineers have become fascinated by this ancient Roman achievement in recent decades and have begun attempting to recreate and improve upon this self-healing capacity in modern materials, even going so far as to incorporate bacteria or capsules of healing agents into new concrete formulations in hopes of restoring this lost property to contemporary construction. The fact that we abandoned this superior technology in favor of cheaper and faster manufacturing methods, and only in recent years have begun trying to reinvent what our ancestors had already mastered, speaks to how easily civilizations can lose knowledge and capabilities, and how the passage of time and the pursuit of convenience can cause us to discard genuine improvements in favor of diminished alternatives that we accept as inevitable progress. There exists a material so legendary in human history that its very name conjures images of invincible warriors and impossibly sharp blades that could slice through armor and bone with supernatural ease. Yet the truth of Damascus Steel represents one of the most fascinating intersections between myth, metallurgy, and the human tendency to mythologize what we do not fully understand. The original Damascus steel, also known as Wootz steel, was forged centuries ago in the Middle East using a complex process involving crucible steel that was repeatedly heated, folded, and hammered until it achieved a distinctive wavy pattern on its surface that seemed to capture something almost otherworldly in its appearance. Crusaders returning from the Holy Lands spoke in hushed tones about swords crafted from this mysterious material that never dulled, never broke, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to cut through anything placed before them. And these accounts were not entirely fabricated, as the material genuinely did possess superior properties compared to the crude steel production methods available in medieval Europe at that time. The actual mechanism behind Damascus steel's remarkable properties involves the creation of a microstructure containing various carbon phases, carbide networks, and specific crystalline formations that resulted from the particular ore sources used, the temperature control during forging, and the repeated folding technique that distributed these elements throughout the blade in a way that distributed stress more effectively and created a harder cutting edge while maintaining flexibility in the body of the blade. However, the knowledge of how to produce authentic Damascus steel was lost sometime in the 1800s, possibly due to changes in the ore sources available in crucible steel production or the abandonment of traditional techniques in favor of industrial steel manufacturing, which meant that the mystery deepened considerably, and the myth grew to encompass claims that the steel possessed properties that defied the laws of physics entirely. With some claiming it was folded thousands of times, or that master smiths whispered incantations during the forging process. Modern metallurgists and bladesmiths have made significant progress in recreating Damascus steel through careful analysis of historical samples and experimentation with various folding techniques and steel compositions. Yet even their most successful attempts reveal that the legendary reputation often exceeds the material's actual capabilities, reminding us that human perception and storytelling have as much power to shape history as the physical properties of the objects themselves. In the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire faced an existential threat from rapidly advancing Arab naval forces that seemed poised to conquer Constantinople itself, the crown jewel of Christian civilization and the last great bastion of Roman power in the Mediterranean world. During this desperate period of conflict, Byzantine engineers and chemists developed a weapon so devastating, so terrifying, and so utterly effective that it would transform naval warfare forever and ensure the survival of their empire for another 800 years. This weapon was called Greek fire, and it remains one of history's most mysterious and fearsome inventions, a substance so powerful that contemporary accounts describe it as almost supernatural in its capabilities and destructive potential. The exact composition of Greek fire has been lost to history, though scholars and historians have spent centuries attempting to reconstruct it through careful analysis of ancient texts and experimental archaeology. Most scholars believe the formula contained a mixture of crude oil, naphtha, quicklime, and sulfur, combined with saltpeter and other ingredients that created a substance capable of igniting spontaneously when exposed to water or even moisture in the air, turning the very ocean into a weapon of annihilation. When deployed from specially designed bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships, Greek fire would spray across the water in great arcs of flame, igniting the wooden hulls of enemy vessels and creating walls of fire that spread across the sea's surface, impossible to extinguish through conventional means. The psychological impact of this weapon cannot be overstated, for soldiers and sailors who witnessed it firsthand became convinced they faced something beyond human engineering, something almost magical in its terrible power. Contemporary chronicles describe the weapon with an almost reverent tone, noting how enemy fleets would flee in panic at the mere sight of Byzantine ships, knowing that resistance meant incineration and death by fire in the most horrible imaginable way. What makes Greek fire so remarkable as a historical phenomenon is not merely its technical ingenuity or its devastating effectiveness in combat, but rather how completely it vanished from human knowledge and capability, becoming almost legendary in nature despite having been used regularly for nearly 4 centuries. The loss of Greek fire's secret formula represents one of history's greatest technological disappearances, a complete erasure of manufacturing knowledge that suggests either deliberate destruction of records or the sudden loss of skilled craftspeople who carried the secret in their minds and hands rather than in written documents. Imagine discovering a corroded lump of bronze and wood pulled from the wreckage of an ancient Greek shipwreck off the coast of a small island, and then spending decades realizing that what you held in your hands was essentially an ancient computer, a device of such mechanical sophistication that nothing remotely like it would appear again for over 1,000 years, a fact that fundamentally challenges everything we thought we understood about the technological capabilities of the ancient world. The Antikythera Mechanism was discovered in the year 1900 and won by sponge divers exploring a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera, and what they found was a bronze device no larger than a shoebox, containing at least 30 interlocking gears of varying sizes, each one precisely calibrated and fitted together with a level of mechanical precision that seems almost impossible for an object created around the 1st century before Christ. Modern analysis using X-ray technology has revealed that this device was designed to predict astronomical positions and lunar eclipses for decades in advance, functioning as a mechanical calendar that could track the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but the mechanical advantage of interconnected gears and mathematical ratios encoded directly into the metal itself. The psychological mechanism that kept this discovery from immediately revolutionizing our understanding of ancient technology was rooted in a kind of institutional skepticism, a reluctance to accept that such sophistication could have existed in a time we had categorized as less advanced, leading scholars to initially dismiss or downplay the device's significance for many years, treating it almost as a curiosity rather than a revolutionary artifact. We constructed narratives about technological progress that moved in a neat, linear fashion from primitive to advanced, and the Antikythera Mechanism violated that comfortable story so thoroughly that even when it was right in front of us, we found ways to minimize its implications, suggesting it might have been a one-off creation, perhaps a toy, perhaps something that didn't truly represent the capabilities of the broader civilization. Yet the device persists as evidence that knowledge can disappear entirely, that entire technological traditions can vanish, leaving behind only fragments and mysteries, and we continue to normalize this idea that progress is inevitable and unidirectional, even though the Antikythera Mechanism stands as a bronze testament to how much we can lose, how much we have lost, and how little we truly understand about the depth and sophistication of minds that lived millennia before us. Deep beneath the surface of the ocean, in the vast darkness where sunlight cannot penetrate, whales produce some of the most complex and haunting vocalizations in the animal kingdom, and these sounds travel distances that would seem impossible given the limitations we typically associate with noise propagation through any medium. A humpback whale can produce a song that travels thousands of miles through the ocean, crossing entire ocean basins and potentially reaching other whale populations on distant continents, which means that a whale singing off the coast of Hawaii could theoretically have its voice heard by whales near the coast of Japan or even further across the Pacific waters. The mechanism behind this extraordinary acoustic phenomenon lies in the unique properties of saltwater, which acts as an exceptional conductor of sound waves, far superior to air in its ability to transmit and sustain acoustic energy over vast distances without significant degradation. Sound waves move faster through water than through air, traveling at approximately 1,480 meters per second in saltwater, and this denser medium allows low-frequency vocalizations, particularly those produced by whales, to propagate without the rapid energy loss that would occur in any terrestrial environment. Whales have evolved to produce songs within frequency ranges that are optimized for long-distance transmission, utilizing the sound fixing and ranging channel, or SOFAR channel as it is known, which is a horizontal layer of ocean water at a specific depth where sound velocity reaches its minimum value, creating a natural acoustic waveguide that traps and carries sound waves across ocean basins with remarkable efficiency. These vocalizations serve purposes that scientists continue to explore, including communication with other members of their species, the establishment of territorial boundaries, and the coordination of breeding activities. Yet the fact that these songs can travel such incomprehensible distances suggests a communication system far more sophisticated than we can fully understand. Despite our technological advancement and our ability to track these acoustic transmissions with hydrophones and underwater listening devices, we have accepted this phenomenon into our mental framework of ocean life, without truly grasping what it means that whales can essentially sing to one another across the width of entire oceans, maintaining a vast underwater conversation that spans the planet in ways that seem to defy the ordinary rules of physics we observe in our everyday lives. When a blue whale calls out in the Indian Ocean, its song may reach ears thousands of miles away, yet we cannot know with certainty whether those distant whales comprehend the message or simply perceive a sound whose origin and meaning remain forever obscured by the intervening water and time. Imagine standing on the shore of a massive body of water so dense with salt that your body refuses to sink, no matter how much weight you carry or how little you struggle against the surface. And this phenomenon persists in one of the lowest points on Earth, where the Dead Sea stretches between Jordan, Israel, and Palestine as a haunting testament to extreme salinity and the peculiar physics of buoyancy. The Dead Sea contains approximately 9 times more salt than the ocean itself, with concentrations reaching nearly 34% salinity in some areas, which means that swimming here feels profoundly unnatural, as your body becomes inexplicably lighter and more buoyant than it should be, your legs floating upward involuntarily while your torso remains impossibly horizontal above the water, creating an eerie sensation of weightlessness that contradicts everything your mind expects from water. This extreme density exists because the Dead Sea is a closed system with no outlet to the ocean, allowing minerals and salts to accumulate over millions of years, while water evaporates constantly under the intense Middle Eastern sun, leaving behind increasingly concentrated brines that have transformed this ancient lake into something that barely resembles normal water. The psychological experience of floating here borders on the uncanny because your body responds to physics in ways that feel almost supernatural. You cannot drown through conventional means, you cannot achieve the swimming motions that feel natural in regular water, and you cannot escape the buoyancy even when you attempt to submerge yourself completely, which creates a profound sense of helplessness mixed with security that is deeply disorienting. What makes this phenomenon persist despite its logical explanation is that human experience rarely matches the extreme ends of natural possibility, and so even though we understand the science perfectly well, actually experiencing it produces a vertigo of the mind where you realize that the rules you assumed were universal are merely rules that apply to the 99% of Earth that isn't this place, and somewhere in the deep part of your consciousness that still fears the water. That knowledge creates an unsettling unease that no amount of scientific understanding can fully dissolve. The Dead Sea's surface, now dropping nearly a meter every year due to evaporation and upstream water diversion, transforms this geological anomaly into a slowly vanishing world where the experience of floating becomes a meditation on impermanence, a reminder that even the most extreme and seemingly permanent features of our planet are subject to the relentless forces of change and human intervention. The minerals left behind as the water recedes form ghostly white crusts along the shoreline, crystalline monuments to a disappearing sea, while the experience of floating here transforms from a curiosity into an elegy for a world that is literally evaporating before our eyes. If you were to step outside right now and look up at the night sky, you would be perceiving only the tiniest fraction of what is actually surrounding you in every direction, because filling the entire universe in all directions, penetrating through your body, through buildings, through planets, and through the vast emptiness of space itself, is something called cosmic background radiation. This is the afterglow of the Big Bang itself, the ancient light that has been traveling through the cosmos for over 13.8 billion years, and it permeates absolutely everything around us at this very moment. What makes this particularly remarkable is that this radiation was released when the universe was merely 380,000 years old, and it has been expanding and cooling ever since, transforming from visible light into microwave radiation that our eyes cannot detect, but that our instruments can measure with extraordinary precision. Scientists discovered this phenomenon quite by accident in 1964 when they were trying to eliminate static from a sensitive radio antenna, and they realized that this persistent noise was coming from every direction in space equally, suggesting something far more profound than any terrestrial source. The cosmic background radiation exists at a temperature of approximately 2.7 Kelvin, just a few degrees above absolute zero. Yet it carries within it subtle temperature variations of only 1 part in 100,000, variations that represent the seeds of galaxies, clusters of matter that would eventually collapse under gravity to form stars and planets, and everything we see in the universe today. What is genuinely astonishing is that this radiation tells us that the early universe must have been extraordinarily uniform and hot, a nearly perfect soup of energy and particles, and the tiny fluctuations we observe today represent the infinitesimal quantum variations that were magnified by inflation into the cosmic structures we observe now. Despite this being one of the most profound pieces of evidence that the Big Bang Theory is correct, and despite the fact that it surrounds us constantly, most people live their entire lives without ever consciously thinking about it or feeling any sense of wonder at the realization that they are literally bathed in the oldest light in existence, ancient photons that have been traveling for longer than our sun has existed, longer than our planet has existed, longer than any biological life has existed on Earth. Yet every atom in our bodies was forged in the hearts of stars that formed from those primordial density fluctuations, meaning we are not merely bathed in this ancient light. We are quite literally made of the universe's response to it, descendants of the cosmic structures that arose from those infinitesimal quantum whispers. Consider for a moment the remarkable tensile strength of spider silk, a material so extraordinarily resilient that a strand of it thinner than a human hair possesses strength comparable to steel of the same diameter, yet maintains a flexibility that steel could never achieve, and this is not theoretical or exaggerated in any meaningful way, but rather a documented scientific reality that challenges our fundamental understanding of what biological materials can accomplish. Spider silk, which spiders produce from specialized glands located in their abdomens and extrude through microscopic spinnerets, achieves this astonishing combination of properties through a precisely organized arrangement of protein molecules that align in a way that distributes stress evenly throughout the entire structure, allowing the silk to absorb tremendous amounts of energy before breaking, which is why a spider web can catch and hold a flying insect traveling at considerable speed without tearing, and why the web itself can support wind forces that would shred ordinary fabric into useless fragments. The mechanism behind this strength lies in the molecular architecture of the proteins themselves, primarily a protein called spidroin, which arranges itself into crystalline regions interspersed with amorphous regions that provide elasticity. And this layering creates a material that is simultaneously rigid enough to support weight and flexible enough to stretch dramatically without permanent deformation. A property combination that engineers have spent decades attempting to replicate in laboratories with only partial success. What becomes psychologically compelling about spider silk is how it persists in our modern understanding despite our awareness of it. For we have somehow normalized the fact that a creature with a brain smaller than a grain of sand produces a material stronger than the steel cables we use to suspend bridges. And we have accepted that spiders have been manufacturing this extraordinary substance for over 300 million years, while humans only recently developed the technology to even measure its properties accurately, which suggests that nature has solved engineering problems that we still struggle with. Yet this reality generates no existential crisis in our consciousness, no widespread amazement at the boardrooms of industrial manufacturers. Because we have trained ourselves to compartmentalize the impossible when it comes from nature, rather than from human ingenuity, allowing us to read these facts and nod along as if they are merely interesting trivia, rather than evidence that the material world operates with capabilities far beyond what our daily experience suggests is possible. Beneath the crushing atmospheric pressures of Saturn, in a realm where winds exceed 1,800 kilometers per hour, there exists a geometric formation so perfectly structured that it seems impossible the natural world could have created it without conscious intention or design. This is the Hexagon on Saturn, a storm system positioned directly over the planet's north pole that has maintained its precise six-sided shape for decades, persisting through the violent chaos of one of our solar system's most turbulent worlds. The hexagon measures roughly 25,000 kilometers across, making it larger than Earth itself, and its edges are defined by jet streams that move at speeds exceeding 400 meters per second. Yet somehow these incomprehensible velocities do not distort the formation's mathematical perfection. The storm rotates with a period of approximately 10 hours and 40 minutes, and its color has deepened from blue to a golden hue over the years as ultraviolet light transforms methane ice particles suspended in the upper atmosphere. Scientists believe the hexagon forms through a process called baroclinic instability, where the collision of jet streams at different atmospheric layers creates standing waves that become locked into this geometric pattern, similar to how water in a spinning bathtub forms a vortex, but infinitely more complex and sustained. The formation persists because the Coriolis effect from Saturn's rotation, combined with the specific temperature gradients and wind shear patterns in that region, maintains an equilibrium that constantly regenerates the hexagonal boundaries, no matter what disturbances attempt to disrupt it. What makes this phenomenon so deeply unsettling to contemplate is that we have normalized this impossible geometry as simply another natural feature in our catalog of planetary science. Yet if someone described encountering a storm shaped like a perfect hexagon here on Earth, we would immediately dismiss it as fabrication or divine intervention. And perhaps this disconnection between what we observe in the cosmos and what we accept as reality reveals something profound about how our minds categorize the knowable world. We observe Saturn's hexagon with scientific curiosity and mathematical appreciation, yet we reserve our sense of wonder for phenomena that conform to our terrestrial intuitions, suggesting that the truly extraordinary in nature is often that which exists beyond the reach of our evolutionary expectations. Perhaps this is why the hexagon endures in our collective imagination not as a curiosity, but as a reminder that the universe's most profound mysteries are often hiding in plain sight, requiring only that we expand our willingness to accept that perfection and chaos are not opposites, but partners in the grand architecture of creation.